Welcome to Mr. Nightbleed. Tonight, in 7 disturbing moments cemetery workers never talk about, we step into the silence of graveyards after midnight, where every gust of wind carries a memory and every shadow has a story. These are the moments buried deep beneath the soil, whispered only by those who keep watch over the dead. They've seen lights glow in locked crypts, heard shovels scrape when no one was digging, and felt unseen eyes follow them through rows of stone. These aren't campfire tales. They're the things real caretakers will never forget. My goal this month is to reach 3,000 subscribers. Nearly 90% of viewers listen but vanish without subscribing. Don't be one of them. Join the darkness. Subscribe now. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and what hour of the night it is for you. And if there's a cemetery near you that gives you chills, type its name below. Because even in death's silence, some things still whisper back. Kill the lights, breathe slow, and let us begin. The first sound was the nameplate rattling on C13, just a dry clink against stone that cut through the wind and the drizzle, in a way I still hear in my teeth. The second sound was 3 slow bell tugs from the chapel tower, far away, steady, too measured to be wind. I remember freezing with the mag light hung at my side and the chain link fence behind me ticking as the gusts leaned into it. The third sound was the soil settling with a breathy sigh, the kind a fresh grave makes after you tamp it and walk away. I'm the one who tamped that ground last week. I'm the one who knows what it should sound like. I'm a 34-year-old night groundskeeper at Red Quarry Memorial outside Odessa, out by the pump jacks that nod like tired iron heads in the dark. I took the job last year after I got sober and needed something quiet enough to keep me from people, but not so quiet I'd end up inside my own head all night. The cemetery has all the basics: a chain link perimeter with barbed wire on top, a watch house no bigger than a 2-car garage, a little chapel with a bell rope that only the pastor is supposed to pull, the caretaker's shed with our tools and coffee thermos lids that never seal right, a columbarium wall, a row of old family mausoleums dark as vaults, and 5 long fields of headstones laid out in rectangles like spreadsheets of names. They say a breeze never stops here. Most nights it smells like wet dirt, cut grass, and a metallic tang that's probably the pump jacks, but it stings the back of your throat like vinegar if you breathe too deep. I keep my mag light in my left hand, my Motorola clipped to my jacket, and the brass key to the chapel on a lanyard against my chest. I twist it sometimes when I'm nervous. That night I twisted it so hard the edges bit through the cotton. It was February and the drizzle was the kind that creeps into everything. Sodium lamps cast their sick orange puddles out along the lanes, and each puddle is a little stage where things appear and then fade to black. I was doing the first loop, checking that the north gate was relocked, that Ty had put the Fisker's spade away instead of leaving it leaned like an invitation, that the chapel doors were secured. Ty works evenings and leaves sunflower seed shells wherever he goes. He's 22, fast, and talks like his mouth is trying to keep up with his thoughts. We overlap for 10 minutes at shift change in the watch house. He flips his steel trimmer manual shut and says, "You good, Manny? Wind's weird tonight, man," and raps the counter with his knuckles twice before he goes. He always smells like green twine and gasoline. There's also Ms. Yolanda in the day office, lavender lotion and the sound of paper, and old Mr. Pena, the head gravedigger, who calls me hombre and wears diesel-scented coveralls. Lupita is my supervisor, short, sharp, and not afraid to call you Mijo until you do something right. I took the lane that cuts between B row and C row. On the clipboard, the day's entries were clean: 1 cremation niche, 1 graveside service in B7, no burials scheduled, no deliveries due. C13 was noted as clear. I know C13 because I string trimmed it 2 afternoons ago while shadowing Mr. Pena. It was open turf with a tiny dip where the soil had settled years back. No headstone, no marker even. This is why the nameplate rattle made my scalp prickle. I swung the mag light and the beam found a new headstone that hadn't been there 8 hours earlier. It was granite, wet and dark, the ground around it undisturbed, no tracks from a backhoe or even boot soles. The engraving was clean and white as bone. It said Manny Ortega, and under that the date I was born. There was no date on the right side, just a dash and the suggestion of space. When you're sober, you make lists automatically. You ask, what can I control? You take inventory. I backed away and I breathed and I told myself this was some vandalism prank or a cruel mix-up where the wrong slab got dropped. The drizzle turned from a smear into fine needles, and I pulled my hood up. I checked the ground with the light. No one had been there. The dirt was a crust that would have kept a footprint like a photograph. All I saw were my own boot prints stopping just shy of the base. No machine marks, no ruts, no onion peelings from a tree root lift. The stone sat like it had grown there. My radio crackled and then hissed. The channel we keep between me and the gatehouse popped like static popcorn and resolved into a voice I haven't heard since the day I put that voice down for good. It said, "My breaker 19, you got Red Rider on." My old CB handle. My old voice. I killed the radio before it could say more, and I hated that I did it. Because that's not what you do in a job where the first rule is never turn off your ears. But I did it. I didn't want to hear myself come out of the air. I put the radio back on and it was dead quiet. Only the wind on the chain link and far-off metal complaints from the oil field. I wrote the headstone down on the clipboard, because doing the procedural thing makes it real in a way that helps, and I took a photo with the little work phone that lives in the watch house desk. The phone glitched. It showed the stone for a second, then the screen divided into 4 squares like a security monitor, and each square was the stone again, but the name was blurred like steam on glass. I put the phone back and told myself it was water on the lens or the cheap plastic cover. Then I went to the gatehouse and pulled the camera feed. The recorder blipped blank between 1:11 and 1:17 a.m. Then it resumed. In the minute after, the upper corner of the frame jittered like something heavy had bumped the post. We're in the habit of calling Lupita when anything bigger than a coyote shows up. I called anyway because it meant a human to talk to. Her voice came sleep-thick and annoyed and honest, a comfort.
"Get a plate," she said.
"If it's some idiot bringing stones in the night, we'll catch him tomorrow at daylight with a truck and a receipt." She told me to add a note to the log and double-check that the chapel was locked. "And Manny," she said, "don't be dramatic." "Not dramatic," I said. "Just careful. Careful is good," she said. "Careful is how you keep this job. And your hand's out of trouble." "Mijo, breathe." I did. I checked the chapel. The door was latched. The brass key on my lanyard sat warm where it should be. I pressed my ear to the door and I swear I heard the rope inside move. Not the bell. Just the rope that hangs down behind the glass. A soft brush sound like coarse fiber against wood. I left my palm flat on the wood and it vibrated 3 times as if someone tugged 3 patient inches and let it back. I looked up at the tower. The clapper is chained most nights so wind can't ring it. The chain was still on. No bell sounded. Just that small motion in the rope and the vinegar metal smell deepening until it felt like tears. I went back to C13 because leaving it there without understanding would have sat in my head like an itch. I told myself I would look for any tell that the stone wasn't real. New stones sit proud for a day or 2 before the ground's weight makes them honest. I put my hand to the base and it was warm. In February drizzle, at 1:30 in the morning, the stone was warm. A gust pushed through the chain link and the nameplate screws rattled. I crouched to check the screws and that's when I heard the tapping beneath my knees. Soft and patient. 3 taps, then a pause, then 3 again. The first beat of unease had been the stone itself. The second was the camera blackout. The third was my old CB handle waking up in the radio like a ghost in the wire. The fourth was the tapping trying to work a rhythm into my bones. I laid the mag light down so that it pointed across the dark grass to the older stones. Rain beads built silver flecks across the beam. The soil around C13 didn't look disturbed. I knew I would look insane prying at a stone with no ticket. But I also knew that if I called in a deputy right then, he'd walk the loop with me, stand at the edge and say, "It's a prank, sir," and go back to a heater and a place with a clock on the wall. I wanted someone who lived in our hours, not theirs. I keyed the Motorola and called Ty, even though he should have been home. It rang dumbly in the dark until finally he answered, whispering, "The way you do when you share a room and don't want to wake someone." "Dude, I knew you'd call." I left a steel can. "Did you get it out of the shed?" "My bad." "You hear anything weird leaving out of here?" "Wind was howling," he said, then his chewer crackled. Trash bag fluttered. I thought the bell went once, but I think it was the rope. 3 tugs, I said. He went quiet. "So you heard too? You ever have the bell rope move without the bell?" I asked. He made a sound like a shrug. "That rope is old. The clerk says Pastor Ellison oils it at Christmas so the fiber doesn't go. It swells in weather." "The stone, Ty," I said before he could spin more excuses. "C13, there's a headstone with my name on it." He tried to laugh and it came out as a thin leak of air. "Don't mess, Manny. "Get some sleep," I said, because he was far away and not useful, and because I didn't want him to tell anyone else how my voice sounded. I went to the shed for the pry bar we use for small adjustments. I told myself this was a safety check, that a piece of granite sitting wrong could topple and hurt someone. The shed is a stink of oil and old grass, warm tools, and a damp rag smell that never dries. The steel cans sit like little fat toads under the bench. My Fisker's spade leaned clean where I left it. I grabbed the pry bar and a chisel and the small hammer that fits my hand. I took the brass key off my chest and put it in my pocket because it was clicking the zipper, and every small noise felt amplified. The drizzle shifted to a steadier rain you could feel on your eyelids. I set the mag light again so I could see the seam at the base where stone met soil. The right side nameplate screw wasn't tight. I set the flat head against it and gave it a turn, and it complained but moved. It's funny the things that quiet you, tiny habits. I kept one hand on the stone as if it were a person, and I told it what I was doing. "Just testing," I said. "Just checking." The tapping below me stopped, and listening into that stop was worse than listening into the sound. I wedged the chisel and tapped lightly, then harder. Stone sang a high, sharp report that moved along my molars. The seam wasn't a seam at all. It was a hairline crack that widened when the hammer hit a certain spot, as if something under there exhaled. The crack let a thread of breath rise up, warm, like from a dryer vent, and the smell was the vinegar metal I'd been catching all night, only stronger, like opening a tin left in the rain. A voice came up with the warmth, soft and patient and practiced. I admitted I was powerless over alcohol, that my life had become unmanageable. The cadence rolled out the way it does in church basements with coffee that tastes like a fight. The voice was mine, but the version of mine that still shook when I told the truth. Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. The soil pushed gently against my fingers with each sentence, like the ground mouthed the words. Something happens in your head when you hear yourself from a time you don't want back. I looked around to make sure I was still here and not back in that other life. And the cemetery met me with its lights and rain and jack pump silhouettes nodding. The radio on my shoulder sizzled, and a different version of my voice said, "Red Rider, this is Red Rider, you reading?" and laughed after, low and ugly, the way I always hated my own laugh. The laugh sank and the ground breathed. The voice under the stone continued, a little faster now, like a rehearsal. By the third step, I had the pry bar engaged. My gloves were wet and gritty. I leaned all my weight and the stone didn't lift. It shifted a fraction and the nameplate rattled, and those 3 slow bell tugs rolled across the grounds. Not from the tower, but from somewhere under the chapel, like the bell was inverted below the floor, and someone was drawing the rope in careful breaths. The rope shushed wood again. The brass key pressed hard in my pocket. "Made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves," said the voice from the ground. And I said out loud, "I am not doing this with you, like a man in a room, trying to stop a bad argument with himself, because I know how to get myself climbing a ladder to places you don't come back from." This had all the shape of that, I kept prying. Dirt lifted at the edges in crumbly pieces that should have fallen back but didn't. The seam widened to the width of a tongue depressor. The breath out of there grew stronger and the air up top grew cold, like the exchange was literal. Warmth up from below, cold pushed down to fill it. My fingers went numb. My mouth tasted like I'd licked a copper penny. The drizzle turned to a sheet, then backed off to a mist. Sodium light jittered, then steadied. I'd like to tell you I called someone again. I didn't. I felt a need to make the voice adjust to me, to force it to listen to my hands. I levered and the stone gave another fraction. Under the words it spoke, I heard the quietest layering of more voices, like echoes practicing in a choir loft before anyone fills the pews. If you've ever stood in an AA room while people recite the prayer, 100 voices in low unison, you know the way it seems inside your chest. It was that filtered through dirt. A steady shape appeared in my mind without permission. I saw Lupita standing in the watch house in her yellow sweater, clicking her tongue twice while she reads the log, then rubbing the heel of her hand over the counter thinking about her mother. I saw Pastor Ellison looping a scarf, tapping the bell rope with the back of his hand to feel the give of it. I saw Ty spitting seeds into a paper cup and laughing with his head back, the sound a little too loud. I saw Ms. Yolanda arranging chrysanthemums for Ms. Reyes in B2, her lavender lotion catching at the edge of my wind-burned knuckles when she handed me a map. Background faces, alive in places that had nothing to do with me. The cemetery keeps its own list of you. It writes your posture down, It catalogs your hands. The voice reached step 5. Admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. It was me at 32 the first time I said it, like I meant it. This time it had a velvety echo that wasn't a room. It was dirt. It was the undersurface learning the taste of what we say. I pushed harder and the seam became 2 seams. My palm slid. I put the pry bar down and dug with my fingers, which is stupid and disrespectful, and I knew it. But the notion of a tool felt like a break in something bare that had to stay bare. The ground was warm where it should have been cold. The warmth wasn't kind. It carried a breath that drew in as long as it exhaled, the way a sleeper does when they're dreaming heavy. The voice found step 6. It paused, waiting. I stared at the name and wanted to spit on it and didn't. "Ty to Manny," the radio said in Ty's real voice now. Not my old one. "Dude, I can't sleep." "You okay? Do I come back?" "Stay home," I said, and the tremor in my throat made me sound cold. "Tell Lupita in the morning there's something wrong with the chapel cam." "You hear the bell?" "I hear the rope." "Same thing," he said, and tried to laugh again, and it died in the channel noise. "You got your key?" "In my pocket." "That's good," he said, as if the key itself was a talisman that could handle any mechanism in the dark. "Hold it." I held it, thumb pressing the little worn engraving that says Ellison Chapel. I'd never noticed before that the letters had a shallow ridge. My finger traced E, then L, like a nervous kid learning to read. The ground below warmed another degree. The steps resumed. 7, 8, 9. My mouth moved with them because that is what muscle memory does. I forced myself to stop. I gripped the brass key until the edge hurt. The wind flagged, and for a moment everything went quiet in the way that makes the world tilt. The chain links stopped ticking. The jack pumps stopped nodding, at least the sound of them did. The sodium lamps didn't hum. Under that quiet, I heard something I didn't want to hear. And once I named it to myself, I couldn't unname it. It was the sound of a bell rung in water. Not the bright peal, but the walloped, weighty dunk of a clapper moving through resistance. Not from the tower. From under the chapel, where old floodwater used to pool in storms. 3 slow pulls, like someone making sure I could count. 10. The voice under the stone softened when it said 10. It always does. Continued to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. It sounded like relief and rehearsal both. It sounded like a thing practicing being a person. I didn't want the 11 I knew was coming because I knew what it would pull behind it. I put my mouth near the seam like a fool at a confessional, and I said, "If you are me, prove it." It obeyed the form, sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood Him. It had my exact pace when I'm trying not to cry. There is nothing in the world that will make you feel out of your skin like hearing your own breakable sounds from a place that should not speak. The drizzle returned like a screen closing. I took the pry bar again and jammed it, and I leveraged enough that the stone lifted an inch. Warm air poured. It filled my eyes. I saw a darkness below that wasn't nothing but a tunnel of knot light that took the beam of my mag light and folded it unfairly. The smell was copper and vinegar stronger than a strike to the tongue. I meant to drop everything and run to the watch house and call Lupita, and then, if I had to, the sheriff. I meant to be the stable version of myself I tell people I am. What I did instead was lean closer to hear what my wrong voice would do with the last 2 steps. Step 12 is the one that makes you live the others. I hoped stupidly that if it said 12 and said it in a way I could accept, the ground would stop breathing. But you never get the terms you want. The voice said 11 again. It said it slower. It said it like a man kneeling on the floor in a room nobody else bothered to enter. Then it said something that wasn't a step. It said my last name in the exact way my father says it when he's proud and doesn't want to show it. It said, "Manny, bring the key." What key? Not the ring. Not the vines of little keys we keep in the caretaker's drawer. The brass key in my hand warmed like a coin, you worry. The chapel key. Some choices are just wedges already set. The person you used to be taps the hammer. The person you are tries to catch it, and only manages to hold the handle while the head comes down. I stood, I put the pry bar in the grass. I put my hand on the stone. "If I go to the chapel, will you stop saying my steps?" I asked like a barter. The warmth lost half a degree. It felt like a nod. I walked the lane with my head down against the drizzle and my eyes up because every tree has a way of making a man's shape when you're tired. The watch house glowed thin behind me. The chapel stood with its glass dark. I unlocked the door. The smell inside was dry hymnals and old dust and oil on wood. The bell rope hung heavy. My mag light beam slid along the rope's twist. There was a wet mark on the floor under it, 3 dark coins spaced out like a measure. I touched the rope. It was cold. When wind pushes it, you hear fibers scrape the frame. When a hand uses it, you feel the weight of the bell asking for air. I took the rope and gave it an inch. The rope moved, but the bell didn't entertain even a bump. Something had the clapper stilled. I closed the chapel door and turned the key and went into the little crawl I hate more than any part of this job. The one that runs under the chapel floor to where the trap to the bell pull wheel sits. It's dry most nights, a place for spiders and lost pencils, and the smell of old carpentry wax. It was wet that night and not from the rain. My knees soaked cold. The beam of light found the wheel turtle slow turning, although the rope hung slack. Past the wheel was a darkness that trembled like water holding a thought. I moved my light there, and all I saw was a surface that wasn't a surface. The beam got thinner. The brass key in my hand felt too heavy, and I understood, in the part of me that doesn't talk, that I was holding a shape the place wanted. It wanted a measure, not a lock. The key was the right size to call to whatever was making that bell in the ground. I held the key over the knot surface and I said, "I won't." For a long, quiet moment, nothing changed. My breath fogged the beam. I could hear my own heart in my ears. When the change came, it was first as a cold that reached for my wrist, and second as a voice that moved from under C13 to directly under me. It spoke the last step. Having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps, we tried to carry this message, and it paused on the next words the way a person will when they are about to tell the worst thing. The thing they haven't told anyone. The lie tucked under their tongue that makes all their other words rattle wrong. I relapsed, it said. My version of my voice, with the shame I haven't had to hold in a while, laid down there like a body. I drank this afternoon. I drove. I came here to hide. I'm sorry. The key twitched in my grip, just an inch downward, as if the weight of what I'd said had found it, had attached like a magnet attaches to something, quietly waiting for it to close. But I hadn't said it. I hadn't relapsed. I'd gone to the noon meeting at the strip mall next to the pawn shop and drank bad coffee. I'd gone back to the watch house and ate the turkey sandwich Ms. Yolanda left me, and added hot sauce, and it tasted like cardboard, and I didn't care. The lie was not mine. The voice borrowed the furniture of me, dragged it into a room I didn't allow. Anger can be a clean thing when it's all you have that belongs to you. I pulled the key up hard. I crawled backward. My knee banged the wheel. The bell rope above brushed wood. The 3 slow tugs rolled in my bones without the bell moving a hair. I came out of that crawl with mud on my jacket and a bad thing in my throat. And I locked the chapel with the brass key because mechanisms are the small parts of the world you can still enforce. Then I walked back to C13 with the key in my fist. The seam at the base of the stone was a little wider in the rain. The warmth lifted like breath in winter. The voice waited like a child who has built a story and wants you to inhabit it. I took the pry bar up again, and for a mad instant I thought I would unseat the stone entirely, pull it like a tooth, and whatever held its mouth under there would be forced to name itself in air. I put my shoulder into it and my hands into it and felt the old muscles from hauling rig chains burn. The stone didn't gift me a fraction. I was the one who wavered. Some fear sharpens into ritual. I did what my body knew. I set my mag light to shine into the seam, and I took the nameplate screw that had loosened and brought it tight. The name sounded like a thing someone else carried when it came out of my mouth. Manny Ortega, I said, because that's the man listed on the tax forms who keeps the lights on. I tightened each screw with small turns so I could feel the moment it seated metal. The voice below began to repeat 11 again. It didn't push 12 this time. It ran what it had. It ran it in a tone that sounded like a man standing at the coffee urn by himself, running lines before a court date. The radio bumped my jacket with a life of its own. Ortega, Deputy Hendrix's blown-out sinus voice said, pulled from some night last summer when we found a deer tangled in the fence, and he called me by my last name like it was a leveler. For a blinking second, I felt my ribs open at the relief of a real other person. Then the rest of that old transmission played. You got anything you need to report? The camera's showing a blip. It's probably bats. I wanted someone from outside the fence to come hold the world in place. I also knew if I called him and he came and he stood in that drizzle with his hat pushed back and his mouth grinding menthol, he would leave with a shrug because that is how day people survive night things. I set the radio down on the grass like giving up a loud tool. Make amends, the voice said from the ground, quiet again, except when to do so would injure them or others. It had my 3-beat breath at the commas. I pressed my palm flat on my name and I said, "You can't have that." The stone's warmth pulsed once. It reminded me of a mother's hand when she finds a fever on your forehead and her skin is cooler than yours, but her worry is warmer than the world. What came next was the closest thing to an answer I got. It was not words. It was a sigh and a felt pressure upward like the floor of a shallow lake lifting you by degrees. The seam widened, a dry sawed line now, and a sound rose with it. A hum I had thought was the sodium lights until I heard it under the tone of my own blood. I followed it with the light and it wasn't everywhere. It was under the oldest mausoleum steps and it moved like bees in a wall. Only lower, steady, tuned to a frequency your stomach recognizes before your ears name it. The hum moved in a circle and came back to the stone like the world was a loop someone had drawn by hand. I saw in my mind how the maps tie these places together. The watch house, the chapel, the mausoleums like teeth, the columbarium like a hinge, the rows in their neat grid. The hum picked certain corners and lifted them a hair, then let them settle. Soil breathed. Names rattled. The rope twitched. 333. I put the brass key on top of the stone because holding it felt like a dare. The key looked small and old on the wet granite. My name looked new and it made the key older again. The drizzle softened. I sat in the grass and let my pants soak and stared at the name until my eyes hurt. When you work nights, you learn how to wait inside your body. I waited for the thing under the ground to deploy the next argument. It didn't. It just ran the steps in my voice every few minutes like a man testing a microphone for a crowd that might come. As the hours passed, each repetition lost a little volume, like the line we shared was fraying. My mag light's brightness slid, then dipped. Then I tapped it and it recovered, then dipped again. I thought about the coffee pot in the shed with the baked-in ring and the taste we never managed to wash away. I thought about the first time I had to tell Ms. Yolanda we'd lost an order number, and her hand went to her braid and she didn't sigh. She hummed. A barely there hum like holding a tune you don't want to share. The one under the steps answered her without either of them knowing each other. It's all loops. Nights teach you that. Sometime after the clock in my head said 4, my breath started to fog more. Dawn a long time off, but the air preparing. The drizzle had moved east. The wind was a longer rope drawn by slower hands. I picked up the brass key and it was cold again. I put it back on my lanyard. I wiped my hands on my jacket and returned the shed tools the way a man cleans a mess when he knows someone else will see the room soon. I wrote in the log in plain words because plain words keep me honest. Unscheduled headstone at C13 with my name. Tried to lever base. No visible disturbance of surrounding soil. Chapel camera blackout 111-117. Rope movement heard. 3 slow pulls witnessed. Radio interference. Will review with Lupita at 7. I signed it. I don't print when I'm rattled. When Lupita reads my cursive, she says it looks like an ant wrote it. I went back to C13 and stood with my hands in my jacket pockets like a man who's waiting at a bus stop. I told myself I would not speak if the voice spoke. I would not give it anything else of me to wear. It didn't speak. The warmth ebbed. The seam drew itself smaller. Enough that if you hadn't seen it open, you might believe it had never been. The chain link started to tick again. The jack pumps dragged themselves back into their knotting. Somewhere beyond the fence, a truck on the highway downshifted, and the sound came thin and lonely over the flats. When the eastern edge grayed enough to make shapes into things again, I blinked and the stone resolved into grass, flat, damp. The new slab was gone. There was no imprint where it had been. There were my boot prints and the mark from the pry bar where I'd failed to lever what wasn't there. There was a small dark spot from where the key had rested and the rain had pooled around it. That was all, if not for the smell that still lingered. Faintly, vinegar metal on the back of the tongue like a penny held to. Long, I could have convinced myself I'd slept in the watch house and dreamed. I checked the time clock because sometimes the only witness to you is a punch of paper. It said I had never left my shift. It said I was present at each quarter hour all night as if I'd been standing at the machine with my hand on the lever. The watch house camera had taken a clear picture of the counter at 1:14 a.m. Empty. On the paper, someone had written my name as if I'd signed with a pen I don't carry anymore. Lupita came in at 7 in her yellow sweater and her eyebrow climbed as she read the log. She clicked her tongue twice. "Mijo," she said at last, and she kept her voice even. We will check with Pastor Ellison about the bell rope. We will look at the feed. We will walk zero together." She breathed in to say the rest, and then she stopped at the smell like she'd hit a wall she knew once and didn't want to meet again. "Do you taste that?" she asked. "Metal," I said. "Vinegar," she said, and put her hand to the base of her throat like the place had put a thumb there. "Go sleep," she said then, brisk for both our sakes. "Come back at dusk. We make a plan." She put her hand on the counter and it hummed faintly. My bones recognized the note before my ears did. I washed my hands at the sink in the shed until the pink cold leached them clean. I drove to my apartment, and when I lay down, the bed felt like the ground in the moment after tamping. When the shovel's face slides and leaves a skin, and you know the earth is going to breathe once, then remember. I slept without dreaming. I woke before my alarm with the taste of copper and the memory of 3 slow tugs landing soft as cloth. I went back at dusk with the same brass key against my chest. I walked the lane and my boot scuffed small pebbles back and made the sound stones make when they nudge each other and then settle. B7 had new flowers that would droop by morning. Ms. Yolanda left a note for me under a magnet that said, "Check chapel latch, pastor says chain secured. Rope oiled in December." Pastor Ellison's handwriting is not a comfort. It's too neat. It looks like the records we keep for the living that look exactly like the ones we keep for the dead. I took the key to the chapel again because bad ideas often look exactly like the jobs you're supposed to do. The door swung easy. Inside, the rope hung the same as always, heavy and honest. For a heartbeat of generosity, I thought it might just be fiber swelling in weather. Like Ty said, then the rope moved without my hand. The bell above didn't sound. Wood whispered. 3 slow pulls, measured, patient. Somewhere under the steps, that low hum threaded a line that might always have been there, and I'd simply tuned into it now. Like a frequency I was finally cynical enough to hear. I locked the door because that is the part you can do with your hands. I stepped into drizzle that smelled like rain and pennies. Out on Zero, the nameplates didn't rattle. The chain link ticked at the edges. The pump jacks nodded their iron heads. A metronome that belongs to the land. It was just an ordinary night, heavy with the kind of quiet that lists things without writing them down. I tell this as true as I can, the way I'd tell it at a table with stale cookies and a coffee urn and a sign that says keep coming back. I didn't drink that day. I haven't since. But somewhere in the dark under the chapel and the older mausoleum steps, a voice with my shape and my cadence practiced the same steps until they wore grooves, and when it came to the part where it tells the worst thing, it used a version of me I don't own. That makes me angrier than any ghost story ever could. A place holding your sound without your permission is a kind of theft, or a kind of care if you squint different. I can't tell. Nights since then I walk with the mag light cutting thin slabs of light out of drizzle, and I keep the brass key where I can touch it with my thumb. Sometimes the rope brushes wood inside the chapel and I feel the 3 tugs in the bones of the door, with the same patience as the first time, as if whoever is below is testing a line for fray. Sometimes the vinegary metal bite rises and falls like evening tide at the back of my throat. Small, never enough to choke, always enough to name. And sometimes, when the wind dies so flat that you can hear soil shift, C13 will clink its nameplate against the stone that isn't there, just once and then once more and then a last time. 3 measured little notes, as if someone has a hand on the rope of something, and is reminding me gently that they are still under my feet. The rattle started somewhere behind me, a flat metal clatter that skipped along the alleys between the tombs and came back thinner. A drip in the darkness kept moving closer no matter which way I turned, leaving little dark eyes on the concrete. The bell rope that hangs by the chapel door tugged once without wind, then again lazy as a yawn. The air had that vinegar metal bite that touches the back of your tongue before you realize it's in your nose too. I was the only one on the grounds, and I knew because I had counted the keys twice and locked the gate myself. I'm Tasha, second-generation caretaker at St. Orleans Cemetery off Bayou Road. The part tourists don't gawk at because it's all maintenance sheds and the sensible side of mourning. I took the night shift after my mother's stroke. She could still talk then, just not about the cemetery, which was new for a woman who had taught me to sweep with one hand while cataloging family lore with the other. Tonight was another drizzle crawl under the sodium lamps that make the marble glow like old teeth. I was doing the rounds because the storm last week loosened nameplates, and the board wants everything tightened before All Saints' Day. procedural stuff first. I logged the gate as locked at 10:03, a minute late because my Motorola had a sticky button and I had to press twice to hear the chirp. The caretaker shed smelled like wet cardboard and a little bleach. My mag light was new and bright enough to make the Spanish moss throw shadows like handwriting. I checked the chapel to make sure no candles were left burning and paused at the bell rope out of habit, palm on the braided hemp. It twitched a third time, but that had to be the draft finding its way through the warped door. Then the rattle again. Same direction as before, like a nameplate screw thinking about falling. The angel with the salt eyes stands on a low plinth in the alley between the Devereaux and Loren families. Technically a monument shared by both, though it's only supposed to represent the Devereaux, who drowned in 1915 when a boiler blew on their river launch. That plaque is clean because I polished it myself this afternoon, and there are fresh streaks down the statue's cheeks that look like carved tears. I know rainwater when I see it, and I know how it dries. These tracks were wet in a way rain doesn't manage. The first time I noticed, 2 weeks ago, I touched the streak and inhaled it without meaning to. The taste had been pure salt and a little copper, like a penny pressed under your tongue because someone dared you in elementary school. We get small anomalies the way kitchens get ants. A tomb that appears mislogged until you find the replacement ledger page stuck behind the drawer. A gate that's locked from the inside when you know you left it swinging, only to realize the wind nudged it shut and the pin fell on its own. Lantern wicks that refuse to catch because last week's oil turned to wax. Or your hands are damp and you're impatient. I talk myself through everyone like my mother taught me. Explain the little strangeness before it grows teeth. But the angel's tears kept starting fresh and the vinegar metal smell came back with them. Old coins and cheap pickles. Tonight I wiped the face with a white rag, folded the wet part in, blew warm air along the cheek to hurry it dry. I waited while the drip sound paced somewhere farther off. When I turned to leave, I felt a fleck of moisture on my wrist. A streak ran again from the angel's right eye and added itself to the rag like it had never stopped. Jerome Baptiste, who does the day shift and keeps a steel chainsaw in the shed like a pet, laughs too loud when he's nervous and chews cinnamon gum until the whole alley smells like candy. He found me at midnight near the caretaker shed where the roof pings when the drizzle picks up. Gum popping, vest half zipped. "You still at it, Tash?" "Alma's late. She texted she's stuck by canal. I told her I'd do her gate." "Tell her to get here when she can," I said, because Alma Reyes always came late and always brought cafecito so sweet it made my hands jitter. Alma also believes in signs. She says you can't keep a place like this running if you don't let the dead have a voice to complain about hinges. It's not my way, but I don't tell her she's wrong. I felt the vinegar tang again and wiped my mouth, thinking maybe the rag had left a taste on my skin. The Motorola hissed and swallowed a word from the dispatcher testing the channel. Jerome's laughter hung a second too long in the humid air. He tilted his head, listening. "Hear that?" "Which that?" "The bell." "Thought I heard the chapel bell," he said, voice trying on a lightness that didn't fit. "It's cable tug. Doors warped, chain rubs," I said, though the bell was rope, not cable. We both knew that. "The chapel has no electrical anything. You have to pull from inside and it rings slow. 3 beats if you can't control your strength. 3 slow tugs is for a passing," my mother always said. "For a drowned man, you ring 3 slow and then you wait." She always stopped there as if she was remembering something. The next anomaly was a repeat name. I keep the plot book because it's my handwriting that the committee trusts. In a city of above-ground bones, we don't have simple ground numbers. We have alleys of wall vaults and mausoleum blocks that knit into each other like a maze with labels that only ever made sense to Mother. I turned a page and stared at a name in my own upright print that I did not remember writing. Devereaux, updated 1915 cross-reference 2023, and below it, 4 names in faint pencil as if someone sketched them with a tremor. Gloria Martin, Alphonse Dupré, Alma Reyes, and one that wasn't a name but looked like a word you might catch in the corner of your eye. I rubbed the pencil marks and chalky dust jumped to my fingers. It leached pale onto my skin and stayed there like smear from a school blackboard that won't wipe clean. When I went out to the row of temporary crosses for recent burials, the drizzle sharpened to tiny nails. Sodium lamps hummed. I smelled the vinegar metal again, stronger, and it made my saliva thicken. A nameplate screw on the Minotault vault lay on the ground in a ring of damp, the kind of brass screw you can't buy at Lowe's without ordering special. I crouched with my Fiskars flathead, fingers going numb, and refit the screw into the softened hole. The air tasted like pennies. I tightened my mind, counting turns. When I stood, my chest stopped for a breath because the angel at the end of the alley seemed to be turned a fraction. She faces the levee, that's her position. Head down like she's asking forgiveness of the river. That is what I know. But the impression hit me just the same. She had her attention on the shed where the ferric smell of wet tools seeps out. Officer Alphonse. Dupre is our beat cop with a talent for showing up right when you've convinced yourself you imagined something. He carries a peppermint toothpick in the corner of his mouth like he's trying to quit smoking by pretending he never started. He's one of the ones who remember my mother from before she didn't speak cemetery anymore. Around 1, I saw his flashlight flick beat by beat along the perimeter. He tapped the fence with his knuckles where it abuts the levee and says hello to the water, like he's making a pact. He found me at the chapel door, rubbing warmth into my hands. "You hear any tricksters?" he asked. "Just my own boots," I said, though I didn't have the will to pretend. "You ever smell vinegar when you shouldn't?" He sniffed and made a face. "You got something spilled?" He touched the length of bell rope with one knuckle. It shrugged under his finger and hung still. "Dispatch has 3 missing persons calls since supper. Young woman from Gentilly, man from the quarter, and an older nurse from near the river. Names like everybody else. Gloria Martin, maybe," I said, because the pencil in the ledger didn't want to leave my head. He paused with the toothpick stuck between his molars. "Yeah, how you know that?" "It's a big city," I said. I lied with the same rhythm my mother had when parishioners asked if the dead ever sat up. He squinted, not accusing, just weighing. He pushed his cap back, a little damp line on his forehead. "You call if you see anybody. I seen that look you got and I don't like it." By 2, Alma still wasn't through the gate. Jerome did her list and then re-walked my row because he doesn't sleep well if he goes home too soon. I sat in the shed with the ledger open because my hands couldn't keep from turning to that one page. The onion skin paper my mother taped inside the back cover years ago rustled like a breath. She wrote neat, all capitals, and used a pencil with a hard lead that cuts the paper if you press too eager. In a margin I saw, faint as if written under a layer of rain, "Future occupant, Margaret Baptiste." That's my mother's name, except nobody uses the last name. It was written in the slant my hand has when I'm making a grocery list fast. I held the paper close to my mag light, and the letters brightened like they were just laid down. Future occupant is not a phrase we use. We say reservation if we have to say anything like that, and we don't. The vinegar tang sharpened until I had to open the shed door to breathe. The rain had nearly stopped, but every slick surface threw back that sodium orange. The angel had a wet halo where the drizzle gathered and broke along the curls. On the ground, the drops made a rhythm like someone tapping a finger on a desk. I stepped into the alley and the bell inside the chapel let go of itself 3 times, slow and low, the way you ring for the drowned, the sound dragging along the stone and catching in my shirt like a hand. I did not run because I was raised to respect the dead, and because in that moment even fear felt like stepping too hard. Inside the chapel it smelled of candle wax and the damp linen we used to cover the donation box. The rope lay quiet, stiff with old salt. The bell has to be pulled from inside because the exterior pull was removed after some kids got rowdy years back. The sound had no place to come from. I stood under the rope and breathed shallow, alert for footsteps. The air tasted metallic, my mouth watering like before a nosebleed. I kept seeing the pencil dust on my forearm in the shape of letters not fully formed. I rubbed and the mark smeared. In the pew to the right, someone had left a St. Jude card that bubbled at the edges from damp. On the back, someone had written Gloria in block letters and a phone number. I told myself it could be any Gloria. New Orleans has more Glorias than it has stray cats. I walked straight to the angel after that with my rag and the small bottle of polish we use on plaques. The streaks on her face were thicker now, not water, and I am not mad enough to call it blood because it wasn't. It was what I said it was. Salt and a disc of copper on the tongue. I pressed the rag to the eye and the streaks cut right through like the stone wept through cotton. I rubbed her cheeks until the drips thinned. I put my palm against her forehead and felt the chill of carved stone that has caught the night. When I pulled my hand away, there was the faintest heat, the kind you imagine when you move your fingers close to a stove that is off, but still holds a memory of fire. The alley channels sound strange after 2. It gave me the sense that something breathes with you and a half step after. I heard humming beneath the mausoleum steps where men sit at noon to smoke, a vibration that may as well have been in my own ears. The levee on the other side of the fence had gone from a dark shape to a darker one, The siren that lives somewhere off Claiborne coughed once like a throat clearing, and then died. I could see my breath when I let it out slow. Not a plume, more like a private cloud that barely leaves your lips. The vinegar metal smell came again at the same time my stomach turned like I just licked the bottom of a battery. I wiped my mouth on my sleeve and swore. At 3, the Motorola gave me that clipped beep that means someone is calling you by pushing talk too soft. Dispatch said there was flooding near the river bend. Nothing serious, just a warning that the levee pumps might kick on and make the ground shudder. Officer Dupre said he'd circle by again. Jerome finished his extra walk and stuck his head into the shed, eyes too bright. "I'm heading out, Tash. You want the last of Alma's thermos?" "I stole it for you." "Set it down," I said. "Stay safe out there." "Safe's my middle name," he said with a grin that didn't stick. He left the thermos smelling like coffee and sugar. He patted the ledger like it was a pet. "Don't let the paper whisper you to sleep." He made the same joke every time, and this time I froze because whisper was the word that fit the faint scratch I'd been hearing under the drizzle. Not voices. Paper moving against itself. Thin edge rasping like a moth's wing. I closed the book and put the brass key we use for the chapel on top like a weight. When I looked back a second later, the key had turned on its own so that its teeth pointed toward the angel. The names on my forearm resolved near the crook of my elbow when I lifted the maglite again. Chalky film in letters that my skin didn't want. Alma explains dust marks the way grandmothers explain tea leaves. She says what clings wants your attention. On my arm I could see Gloria, faint, and then underneath Alphonse, not in my print but in a loose hand that leaned forward. There was space under that as if waiting for the next. My mouth dried in a rush. I wiped the letters and they blurred, then tightened again as if the dust knew where it wanted to settle. I took the ledger because the object in my hand felt like a plan. I carried it to the angel and opened it on the plinth where the drizzle couldn't reach, because a bougainvillea vine slumped over the top like an umbrella. The entry for Devereaux shifted as I looked, or my eyes did. Names passed and names now wrote over each other. In the right corner, as my light moved, I saw my mother's name again with that ridiculous phrase, future occupant. Under it, in the faintest lines that the paper only showed when the beam flared, a word that could have been me if I was cruel to myself. "Tasha," it nearly said, then shied away like the pencil had second thoughts. "This is the part I will tell straight because I don't need to make it bigger. The angel's eyes are carved to look down and a little to the levee. They do not swivel. I know that. But if you stand to the left of the plinth and you're wet and the night inside the sodium hue makes you feel like your face is a mask you forgot you were wearing, sometimes you catch something out of the corner." The right eye shivered. Not a turn, but the suggestion that it noticed me the way a person notices a door closing. I nearly dropped the ledger. My first thought, clean as a new page, was that if I stepped behind the angel, I would be out of whatever line she was drawing with her attention. My second thought was my mother's voice saying, "Do not ever stand between a watcher and what it watches." Then the bell. 3 slow again, spaced like you could walk between them. I was outside the chapel. The rope hung still and a circle of darker damp showed where I had touched it before. The sound got into my bones in the way a low note in a car gets into your seat and hums your spine. I could feel the air in the alley moving with the vibration. The brass key under my palm seemed to tug, a gentle insistence that made the skin on the back of my hand tighten. The vinegar metal burned the inside of my nose until my eyes watered, and all the marble edges on both sides of me got that swim blur that happens right before tears. Climax is a fancy word, but this was the part where the place made a decision and I had to decide too. The levee pumps kicked on with a cough, and then a steady roar you feel more than hear. The ground didn't tremble much, but the sound filled your teeth. A fizzing started under the mausoleum steps or inside my jaw. The alley was a corridor of orange haze that made every name look like it was written in rust. I pointed my maglite down the narrow throat between the Devereaux and the Lorraine, one side chalked with bone names, the other wiped by years of rain. The beam hit the angel's cheek and turned the salt tracks white. The drizzle had paused, but the drip sound continued closer again. I called Alma even though I knew she wouldn't answer. The Motorola didn't help, not with the pumps dominating the channel. I pushed down the talk button and said my name like a talisman. Officer Dupre's voice came back mudded. I caught my name under the static and then the word "there," which doesn't help anyone. Jerome was probably already across Broad. I stood in the squeeze of the alley and watched my breath. The ledger lay open on the plinth and the onion skin page lifted at the corner with each draft, like a bird trying to decide whether to leave. On my arm, the dust stenciled itself sure as a stamp. Tasha, letters blooming in pale grime, each line set by the ghost of a hand that knew my name better than I did. I wiped and it came back. The angel's gaze was a needle in my skin. Tools help when nerves don't. I pulled the rag again, the white one gone dingy, and the little bottle of polish, and decided to do a thing no one asked for. I set my mag light in my teeth long enough to tie a strip of cloth over the angel's eyes. I'm not an artist. It looked foolish and sad, like a carnival joke. I folded once, twice, pressed the knot under the curls, smoothed the fabric against the stone. My fingers numb. The cloth soaked dark at once at the eyes, damp blooming as if I had put a bandage on a wound that would not admit itself, but the weight of being seen eased for a breath. I took the brass key and slid it into the chapel lock and felt the Yale teeth slide sure into their ward. The lock turned smoother than it does in daylight. Maybe the fog lubed it. Maybe my hand had found the rhythm my mother always used. Inside, the bell rope waited, stiff and a little sticky. I wrapped it around my palm because I had a sudden feeling that if it rang on its own again, I might forget my own shape. I stood with rope in one hand and ledger under my arm and looked back through the open door. The alley framed the angel like a stage. The cloth over her eyes had gone almost black. The drizzle started up, gentle, lying about its intentions. My Motorola crackled, and Officer Dupre's voice cut clear for the space of 5 heartbeats. He said, "I'm at your gate. It's locked from the inside. Tasha, you there? Don't make me hop a fence." His toothpick probably made his words tilt. I said, "I'm here." But the pump swallowed it. The humming under the mausoleum steps picked up until the stone near my ankles vibrated. The vinegar metal filled my head, heavy as a headache. The names in the ledger blurred, then sharpened. The entry that called my mother a future occupant gleamed in a way paper does not do. In the corner I saw the faint outline of my own hand in graphite, as if someone would later accuse me of having written it. I looked at the cloth. The wetness had tracked down to the knot and hung there fat and indecisive. The plinth under the ledger had a wet crescent where the paper had touched and then been lifted. Between standing and doing is the part where, if you don't move, the place will choose. That's true in a traffic circle and true here. I decided, and it did not feel noble. I took the cloth at one corner and smoothed it again, then took the brass key and turned it once more in the chapel door as if a second lock lived there. I stepped out, set my feet on the alley stones, and walked toward the gate, ledger pressed to my chest. The angel did not move because stone does not. The drip sound jumped a foot and landed lower near my knees. The bell did not ring and my hand went numb from holding it back. At the gate, the big iron with the spear tips, I called for Dupre. He was 2 alleys over, confused, his beam describing a restless Z. "Why's it locked?" he said, annoyed at the one thing he could control. I put the key in and it would not turn because the gate lock isn't a Yale, and the key isn't for this, and I knew that. And did it anyway because sometimes you try the wrong key 3 times when you are thinking about everything you shouldn't. "Shed key," I said out loud to myself, to the gate, to the part of me that wanted to stop being the caretaker and be somebody whose shifts end before the dead start to stir in your head. I stepped back from the gate, and the alley funneled the wind right up my sleeves. I kept my back to the fence because the idea of turning my back on the angel felt like kneeling in a crowded church and showing your spine to the door. Dupre's beam intersected mine and he saw my face and I saw him do the cop math of broadcasting calm. "You good," he said, not even making it a question. "I'm going around. Hang tight." "I'm fine," I said. The buzzing under the mausoleum steps deepened until my throat matched it. I lifted the ledger and it fell open to the page I didn't want, like a trick book in a magic show. Gloria's name darkened itself as if water had leaked through from the page above. Alphonse adjusted himself, letters straightening. Below blank space, a shape waiting. I thought about my mother asleep now, the night nurse, the way her lips twitch when thunder rolls. I thought of the times she taught me to press polish into a brass nameplate until the old name shows like a rising loaf. She hated the thought of being put anywhere. She said the cemetery is a place you stand in, not where you end. The levee siren started low. It's more of a tone than a wail, and it tells you when the pumps are going to do more than hum. It came through the fence like a warning you could taste. The vinegar metal leaped to meet it, and for a second I felt like I was underwater. Not drowning exactly, but suspended. I'm not a melodramatic person. I do not pretend to be brave either. I put my hand on the plinth of the angel as I passed back by, like laying claim to an old friend, and set the ledger on top again. I tugged the cloth blindfold once like a sailor testing a knot. Wetness slipped cold under my nails. In the last hour of a night shift, things decide whether they will end. I did the sensible thing that wasn't sensible at all. I went to the caretaker shed and pulled the canvas drape we use for scaffolding covers, hefted it across my shoulder, carried it like I knew what I was doing. I climbed the 2 concrete steps at the base of the plinth and threw the canvas over the angel. It fell wrong the first time, then right, resembling a giant's coat shrugged off. I pressed the edges into the cracks between the plinth and the paving, thought about weights, thought about tape, thought about the rain starting again and the drag of wet canvas. The smell before a storm crept in under the canvas edges and was all vinegar and coins. The drip had a rhythm like someone walking down a long hallway. I stayed there with both hands on the canvas like I was holding the wind down. The pumps thrummed, the siren toned, the bell rope in the chapel brushed my wrist where it hung inside the open door and left my skin gritty. The moment felt like it stretched, then another moment sat on top of it, and the drizzle stopped pretending and came down steady. The canvas darkened. Under my palms it became slick. A line bled through where the angel's eyes would be. The drip gathered, fattier, then let go and hit the toe of my boot. By the time the sky stopped being black and started being that bruised blue that tastes like morning if morning had a flavor, I had forgotten my own posture. Dupre found me like that because he had found the side gate that catches if you lift while you turn. He always did know the trick of locks. He said my name in a voice I'd never heard him use, like his toothpick got stuck somewhere it didn't belong. I turned and my back creaked. He touched my shoulder, not cop careful, just human careful. "You okay?" he said. Again, that not question. He looked at the canvas and I followed his look because all my attention had gone soft and drifted. The cloth over the angel's eyes was soaked to translucence, and below it, the canvas had gone dark in 2 long parallel tracks that had cut through to the stone, lines the color of tidewater, edged in white where salt had dried on the way down. The canvas at the base had a small pool. Not dramatic, not anything a mop couldn't handle. When I reached to lift the canvas, the smell hit me before I could close my mouth. Vinegar and metal, copper and the afterbite of a penny stubborn under your tongue. On the plinth, the ledger lay open where I had left it. The onion skin page had a crinkled wave now, as if it had thought about dissolving and then decided against it. In the margin next to the old pencil block that called my mother a future occupant, a new line sat in a hand I recognized and did not. Maybe it was the way I write when I'm tired. Maybe it was how she wrote when she wanted me to listen. "Tasha," it said. Precise, no flourish, each letter pressed just enough to make the paper dimple. Under that, in my own modest block, a space that wanted ink. I tried the cloth again. My fingers came away damp and tacky with salt that dried chalk white on my hands. Dupre took my palm and rubbed the salt between his fingers like sand. "It's just water," he said, and he knew and I knew it wasn't that simple. He read the ledger over my shoulder and I felt him stop and go still. He did not say my name because sometimes you don't want to attach sound to a thing. The levee siren climbed 1 notch. The pumps coughed. The hum came lighter as the storm gave up. We let dawn walk in step by step, the way it does when the lamps are still on and the birds haven't picked a song yet. The city sounded like someone turning over in bed. Jerome texted a line of apologies and coffee emojis. Alma sent nothing at all. I checked the dust on my forearm and saw the faintest smear where my skin had pushed back, as if letters had been wiped then rethought. I wiped again, and under the salt I caught the shape reforming so light you could pretend it was just a trick of pores. On the canvas over the angel's face, the 2 darker tracks narrowed to points, then faded, then darkened again as if the stone beneath had blinked without needing eyes. I took the brass key and set it on the ledger page because the weight of a small, true thing felt like all I had. The vinegar metal smell thinned as the drizzle did, but it never left. Not entirely. It hung just below everything, low as a bell you can't unhear. When Dupre left to write his report and promise me calls he couldn't guarantee, I stood alone in the alley, sodium lamps clicking out 1 by 1, and listened to the drip that isn't a drip slide back into silence. The cloth over the angel's eyes had dried a little and crusted at the edges. As I folded the canvas to carry it back to the shed, a wet cummer brushed my wrist and left a taste in my mouth before I could swallow. Salt and copper. I do not ring the bell in the mornings anymore, but when the pumps sigh and the levee breathes, I still feel 3 slow pulls in the rope under my hand, and the air takes on that vinegar metal tang like a secret the stone keeps repeating under its own breath. The nameplate on the crypt door rattled once, loud enough to cut through the hiss of snow. A clump of powder slid off the lintel and landed on the stone steps with a soft final sound. Farther off, a bell rope under the watchhouse eave twitched and knocked the wall twice as the wind changed, and chains on the north gate shivered like thin bones. I lifted my mag light and the beam rolled over new footprints circling the Lipinski vault in a perfect ring, heel to toe, 12 inches apart. No approach tracks, no exit tracks. I'm Ron, 53, widower, former cop out of Ulster County, and I was on nights at Hawthorne Hill Cemetery because it was supposed to be quiet, and I thought quiet would let me sleep again. Snow likes this hill. It stacks deep and holds a crust, and even in a winter drizzle it finds a way to drift. The caretaker's shed sits 20 yards from the gate road, a lean rectangle of plywood and bad decisions. Its space heater clicks more than it warms, and I had a steel snowblower that started when it felt like being generous. My job was gates, lights, and whatever the weather pushed across the stones. The town had our number for squirrel-chewed wires and kids thinking the Dead Man's Hill was a sled run, but mostly we were left to ourselves. Marta did the day shift. She brought peppermint tea in a dented thermos and cracked her knuckles one by one when she was thinking. She had taped a sign over the ledger desk that said, with tired humor, "Don't add anybody without paperwork." The Lipinski vault sat on the crest like a stubborn tooth, 19th century granite with ironwork that had always looked too delicate for winter. That night, everything wore a crust of ice that threw back the sodium lamps in a wet halo. The fresh footprints had sunk through the crust and stopped at the door, then kept going around and around. I walked the ring with my beam and saw they hadn't blown in. Edges were too crisp. They were there because somebody had been walking in them, but there was no way to the ring to begin the walk. It felt like someone had been pacing from the inside of the circle, walking my perimeter from the other side of the hill. I keyed my Motorola. Hawthorne Hill to base. I've got fresh impressions around Lipinski. No approach, static breathed. Marty at dispatch sounded like she was cupping her hand over the mic. Copy, likely kids. You need Alvarez? Alvarez was the overnight patrol. He chewed mint gum like it took offense to him. He had a habit of letting the gum snap once before he spoke, like a punctuation mark. It was a quiet night for him, too. Negative, I said. We're good. I'll keep eyes. I logged it the way a cop logs what you can't file under anything else. I wrote, unexplained tracks around family crypt. Drifting snow. No disturbances. My writing looked steadier on the yellow paper than my hand felt. I made myself cross-check the burial book like I always did when a vault showed signs. It's a leather thing. Old as the hill. Swollen with humidity and the smell of vinegar metal that slicks your tongue when you lick a battery. We don't need it for modern work except to answer old families, but every night I went to it like a rosary. The Lipinski pages were mostly filled out by hands that carved ink into paper, check marks older than my father. It was there I found her on the bottom right of a page that stuck together like skin. Her name was written in a tidy, nervous hand, Anna Mae Delaney. On the notes column, in a slant different than the rest, it said, interred pending thaw. No plot assigned. The date was January 12th, and for a second I thought I'd grabbed the wrong book because that was my wife's date, the day Ellen's morphine backlog finally let her sleep through and not wake again. I ran my finger under the old ink and waited. It didn't change. The handwriting sat there in its neat certainty as if time would bow to it. Wind put its shoulder against the shed and something under the floorboards hummed for a second, an almost sound like when you cup your ear to a seashell. The humming came from the direction of the mausoleum steps, as if the stone itself had taken a breath. I clicked off the heater and the silence was colder than the air. The humming died with the heater and the click. I went back out with the Fiskers and salted where the gate road meets the north slope. The wind had shifted to a wet needle rain that hardened as it fell, turning the crust to a skin of glass. Sodium lamps made everything a sick theatrical orange. I did a sweep along the perimeter, then cut up past the chapel and the columbarium, a place of pigeon flutter and bronze nameplates that catch snow in their letters. I passed the caretaker's plots and the widower's row where Mr. Pascoe smoked a pipe on his visits and left the tobacco smell behind. And Mrs. Dalrymple came in a cinnamon coat with paper-white hands and talked to her husband's stone like it had interrupted her. There was a trace of lemon oil on the bench by the Baxter family that evening, Hank's doing, from the way he polished his old truck after he parked for his Sunday visit. I kept making myself do normal things because normal keeps your feet under you. I checked the Yale lock on the Lipinski gate with my glove. It was iced and stiff and would have been a trick to open on a good day. The nameplate rattled once more and then went still as if embarrassed. I made a note of the way the footprints cut slightly deeper at the southeast corner, like whoever had made them had paused there, weight all on one foot. It wasn't until midnight that the orchid appeared. It lay on the step like it had been put down with care. The petals were wind-burned brown at the edges, but the center was warm and slick as if it had just been inside a room. A drop of water trembled on the lip and fell to the stone. Orchids don't happen in our weather, and they don't happen at midnight, not like that. I picked it up between forefinger and thumb and felt the stem give with a human warmth that made me put it down again. At 12:05, my radio hissed and popped. "Alvarez, you still good up there, Ron?" "Copy." I watched the snow come in at an angle and tried not to remember Ellen's morphine schedule, the way the shots had marked the room like bells. 4 hours, 3 hours, 2, until finally the hospice nurse had nodded, that soft motion that means stop counting. I went back to the ledger because I couldn't not. The page with Anime's name looked older than the rest by a color you only get when air eats paper for a long time. When I lifted it, the bottom right corner threatened to split and I eased it back like a broken thing. There were no more notes. No plot number. Just that phrase, interred pending thaw, and a date that blinked like a hazard flasher in my head. Around 1, as the snowstorm settled into a steady hiss, I walked out again, partly to avoid the heater's click, and partly because quiet makes a person hear the wrong things. The footprints were there, still sharp, and now there were 2 more rings, both as clean as if drawn, nested inside the first. No approach tracks, no exit. I did my cop thing. I shined low across the surface, trying to catch any breaks in the crust that would tell me if these were old impressions re-exposed. They were not. The ice still bridged between the prints where the wind should have carved. Whoever had walked was not fighting the weather. It was as though the rings were being traced from below. The humming under the steps returned as I stood at the southeast corner. I put my boot on the lowest stone and felt it through the rubber. It wasn't a vibration so much as a suggestion of one. Like your ear knows there's a refrigerator running in a quiet house. It sighed down the length of the railing and into my glove through the iron. I opened my mouth and tasted copper. I took my hand off the iron and it went away. I put it back and felt it once more, timid and then there, humming faint as breath. I called Marta. She swore in her first language and then in ours. "It's the wind," she said and cracked a knuckle. "It gets under the steps or pipes, or you're being punished for coming to work in January. Can you bring the burial book tomorrow?" "The little addendum," I said. "The one with the ugly brown vinyl. That one had newer notes pinned to newer dead." She made a noise that meant she'd do it after coffee whether I asked or not. At 2, I thought the heater died for good. I clicked it off and on 3 times and it done nothing but click. I laughed once in a voice that didn't sound friendly and put on another sweater. I poured coffee from the thermos and the steam rose into the room and made the place smell like metal. The ledger sat open to Anime. I slid it closer because I kept thinking if I read it differently it might say something else. A thin paperclip fell out from between the pages, a bent brass thing slick with age. I rolled it in my palm and then put it on the desk and smoothed the page, as if that gesture could flatten the moment back into a world I recognized. I must have dozed because the knocking woke me like I'd been underwater. 3 solid knocks. Pause. 2. Pause. 1. Then silence long enough to make a person unclench. And then the pattern started again. The sound came from outside and down, from the direction of the Lipinski vault, as if someone had gone to the door and knocked through the iron and the stone. I lifted the mag light and went, not running because I will not run on ice in a cemetery, but I moved. Snow kicked up in a sting at my ankles. My breath smoked the beam white. I told myself I'd find Alvarez messing with me, and that I'd have to pretend to be mad. At the door, the pattern was in my bones before I counted it. Ellen's schedule. The way the hospice nurse had tapped the face of her watch without touching it. 3 knocks, pause, 2, pause, 1, that soft nurse's nod. I put my ungloved hand on the iron and the humming rose up through the contact and settled in my teeth. The orchid had slid a little in the wind and came to rest against my boot. I picked it up and tucked it in my coat, the way you do when you want your hands to be doing something that isn't shaking. I pressed my ear to the seam of the door in the way I would have made fun of if I were someone else. It wasn't an echo I was hearing. It wasn't storm noise. It was a woman's knuckles counting a pattern any hospice nurse would recognize, and the space inside the vault took the sound and made it feel like I was listening through a body. I nodded before I knew I was nodding. The Yale lock on the gate was red-brown with ice and time. If I could have made a phone call to a version of myself from 10 years ago, inventoried tools, set a perimeter, I would have. Instead, I looked at the iron and the small trust you have in your hands when the world gets narrow. I had the key ring for the grounds, and the new keys shine like a promise, but the old ones are the ones you don't forget. The Lipinski key was brass offset with a tiny square cut. When it slid into the lock, it stopped halfway as if the old and the new had decided not to shake hands. I warmed it with my own breath, smelled copper again, and worked it until it turned. The gate swung in with a dry, intimate sound. There were 3 low steps down, each packed with snow crust. I'd never been in the Lipinski vault. Most are the same: stone, iron, a beer that looks like a table made by people who didn't like tables. The moment I put my weight on the first step, the humming under the stone rose, not loud but close, the way a cat can be loud by being exactly where you were about to put your foot. I moved slow because the world gets you if you go fast. Inside, my light found the beer in the walls and the empty. Dust wept off the edges of the beam in a pretty way, then went dead. There was no person. There was no disturbed stone. On the beer sat a box, simple pine with a little tarnished hasp. It wasn't locked. The knocking had stopped when I opened the gate, as if I had obeyed and the ritual was over. It was so quiet I could hear the thin trickle of thaw. My breath made an indoor shape. I set the orchid on the corner of the beer because it felt rude to keep it. I opened the box. Inside were letters tied with disintegrating ribbon, the cheap kind you get on grocery store flowers, a color that had once been red. On the top letter, written in a steep hand that had learned under harsh light, it said, "To the man who would keep watch." I stood there with the ridiculous feeling that opening a stranger's archive would wake someone who didn't want to be woken. And then I remembered that someone had knocked until my dead wife's pain math fell into my ears and told me to open it. The first letter was dated 1899. A spidery hand, a woman's voice talking about winter the way we talk about cell service. She wrote about waiting for the thaw so the ground could take her. The phrase pending thaw appeared 3 times, careful. She signed Anna Mae Delaney. An old smell rose from the paper like vinegar and metal. The second letter was to a son in the city, apology braided with history. The third was to no one at all, a prayer disguised as instructions. At the bottom of the bundle, the last letter was newer paper, crisp in a way that made the top layers look like they belonged to another species. The ink was thicker. The hand was an echo of the old one, steadier and then faltering as if age had come upon her mid-sentence. The line that hooked me was, "If you are reading, you kept the watch. Thank you for coming." I sat on the low step and read, my light propped against the iron. She said her family didn't sign for plots like other families. They waited on opportunity and weather. She said she had been interred pending thaw in a vault across the river one long winter, and then never quite felt she had been put down in the right place. She made it sound like the ground declined to take her, and she had been stored like a coat in a closet. She wrote about orchids that showed up in the wrong season because her father had loved them, and he brought them to the vault door like he had 100 years to undo a single sting. The last page said in a hand suddenly larger, "It will be the date of a woman you will know." My maiden name is hers. When your count tells you to open, do it. The knock came once, very soft. The electric bulbs at the chapel flickered through the door. I caught my breath like a kid about to jump from a too-high ledge. I am not given to visions, and I don't like a world that takes advantage of a man for being alone. But I also know debt when it sits in front of me. The orchid dripped. The humming under the steps settled into a sound that was more feel. I took my glove off and put my hand on the stone. It was warm. Not in a horror house way, not like a trick. Warm like what happens when the weather shifts and a winter room allows you in a little. I took the ledger page from under my coat where I had tucked it like a superstition and set it beside the letters. The dates matched with a mischief that felt personal. January 12th. I had spent that day organization tired, washing cupboards because I did not know what to do with air. My wife's grandmother's maiden name was Delaney. I hadn't connected that to anything except her old stories about a girl who wore the wrong coat in the snow. There was a map tucked into the letters, a plot map drawn by hand, showing a line from the Lipinski to a fallow square on the east side where no one ever went because the field there sunk in spring. There were instructions for the beer. The board slid. The trap under it opened like a mouth. The storm, up to that point a steady hiss, stood up and took a breath. Snow moved down the staircase like a curtain. I smelled the heater from the shed, that click smell of something trying to be useful. I looked at the opening and I looked at the world beyond my light. The choice was exactly the kind I hated. Make this real with an action or leave and pretend the knock was ice or rats in old air. I put my radio on my belt because if I had it in my hand I would call the wrong person for the wrong reason. I slid the board back further, and the dark below welcomed me by not pretending to care whether I entered. The bowl under the beer was shallow, brick-lined, with a channel that ran into earth. I wasn't eager to know better. It was the kind of place that might have been meant to catch water or something else the builders didn't trust. The letters told me to put the orchid in the bowl and the ledger page above it, and to speak both names. I am not a man for speaking names to rooms, but I said them. I said Anna Mae Delaney, and I said Ellen, as if my voice had borrowed a steadier man. There was a pressure change that made my ears try to pop. The humming under the steps rose and then stopped, like something went back to sleep. The snow outside quieted in that way it does when a band of weather passes, and another hasn't yet thought what it wants to be. I felt foolish and then felt very clear, and then felt 14 years old and prowling under bleachers. I laughed once, kinder this time. The maglite beam grew steadier. The chapel lights stopped their twitch. The orchid lay in the bowl like it had found where it was supposed to be. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for my hips to complain and for the heater in the shed to click back to life like it had never pretended anything else. The radio made a sound that meant Alvarez had keyed and then changed his mind. I took the letters and put them back in the box exactly the way I'd found them, because there are borders you don't cross even if you've already crossed them. When I stood, the knocks came again, once, then nothing. A close nothing, the way a good door answers your hand by moving before you push. I closed the vault. The brass key turned with less argument. I hung the chain the way it had been. I put the ledger on the shed desk and wrote a note on a new page that made no sense to anyone who hadn't stood inside. I wrote, "Located record for Delaney. Status resolved." I don't recommend that word often. Law taught me words are handcuffs if you let them. But resolved felt like it fit the way the stone did after the board slid home. When Marta came on, she took one look at me and poured me tea. She cracked a knuckle and then two more and waited. I told her what could be said without sounding like the sort of man who will talk to walls and applaud when they answer. She shook her head and then, under that, nodded. She pulled the vinyl addendum and found a penciled note from some past idiot like us. Storage concerns in cold years. She laughed and then was quiet for the kind of silence that honors something, even if you don't have a denomination for it. Alvarez came by on his way out and snapped his gum and looked at the orchid on the desk and said, "That yours?" Which is the kind of thing he says when he's asking if you want to be left alone. "Tell Marta to stop making you work Januaries," he added. And then he reached out and, without touching it, touched the space by the letters in a cop's way of blessing. He left me his spare hand warmers because that's how men like us say we see you without getting in the way. The day worked itself into a white glare. I salted the gate road again and leaned the shovel in its spot. I sat in the shed with the heater finally doing what space heaters promise in their names and listened to the cemetery be what it is when the wind is finished, pretending it's something important. The humming under the steps did not come back during daylight. The only sound was the bell rope tapping the watch house twice in a friendly way. When a new weather band came through, night made it a hill again. Sodium lamps floated at the edges. Drizzle came on top of old snow. I walked the perimeter because you keep a promise by keeping the old routes even after something has changed them. The footprints around the Lipinski vault had filled and smoothed, and then disappeared as if a careful hand had brushed them out. The gate's chain hung the way it had before, easy in its old drape. I put my hand on the iron in a way that would have embarrassed me 2 days before, and felt only the cold that stone owes in January to those who ask. At midnight, because my life arranges itself in little habits, I went to the door again. No orchid. The step was wet with meltwater that had the sound of a sleep you keep missing. The gate road was dark and then light again as a car turned somewhere below. The maglite made a circle on the door as if trying to give it a warm place to lean. I took the ledger page out of my pocket, the copy I'd made with Marta's permission, and put it back in. That's the kind of thing that would have gotten me a lecture when I wore a badge, and maybe it still should. I slid my glove back on and stood. Knocks didn't come. Neither did anything else. Quiet's honest when it's done right. Dawn opens slow up here and then is simply there. The heater clicked a last time and held. Dispatch shifted and Marty's voice turned into someone who laughed more. Marta brought pancakes and a paper towel and said nothing when I ate too fast. If there's a happy ending, it's this. I went home and slept in my own bed without dreaming of alarms or schedules or nurses nodding. That sounds small if you've never gone months without sleep because a room decided to count for you. My wife's picture sits on the dresser. The glare from the window finds it in the morning and gives her a small light that moves as the day does. I woke near noon and the house sounded like a friend. It smelled like last night's coffee and the snow that melts when you kick your boots, and the coppery whiff that rides up under your nose in winter was gone. When I went back to Hawthorne Hill the next night, the watch house bell rope hung quiet and the nameplate on Lipinski minding its own. I walked by hand on iron like a man just checking the weather. On some nights when the drizzle turns to small needles under the sodium lamps and the air gets that particular stillness that isn't wind at all, I pause at the top step and listen. There's no need. The ledger sits where it should. The box is closed. The gate is secure, but I learned the hill has its own breathing. Somewhere low, below the mausoleum steps where the stone meets the soft earth, a faint humming holds the place the way a person hums without thinking when a room finally goes as quiet as it's going to get. 3 streets over, a church bell does its morning business, but here, under my boots in the iron, it's only that hush string hum, soft as a woman keeping time for someone who can finally sleep. Soil settled with a soft sigh somewhere beyond the office door and set the fine chain on the bell to a lazy sway. The glass pane in the caretaker's window showed my own reflection and the sodium lamps bleeding orange into the drizzle. But the thing that made me stop mid-reach was a tiny rattle from the nameplate outside, the one that says office. It tapped twice as if an invisible knuckle had knocked it. I thought it was wind until the bell rope on the hall hook twitched once, twice, then a third slow tug that pulled just enough to lift the clapper. The little bell didn't ring. It pressed into silence like something had palmed it. I'm Ellie. I was a 21-year-old student in Glendale by day and the night desk at the Foothill Cemetery by necessity. Tuition is tuition. I worked 12 to 5, alone in the caretaker house that sits between the chapel and the road gate, with the maintenance shed across the gravel. We called it Hillview Memorial, though from the stoplight down on Foothill you just saw the haze over the city and the rows of cypress like dark teeth. Coyotes yipped from the canyons on quiet hours when the traffic hiss died. Tonight had a cold drizzle that plastered leaves to the asphalt and painted halos around every motion light. I was 1 hour into the shift when the computer started typing by itself. It was the red Dell in the corner, the one the day crew called the Fossil. The tower's side panel was scuffed. The keyboard had a missing foot so it sat cockeyed, and the shift key was polished from years of fingers. I heard the dot matrix printer warm up first, the old one we kept for visitor stickers because the thermal wasn't reading right. It gave that grinding zipper noise like it was chewing a belt. I looked over and saw the cursor hop. The screen had the receptionist program open, the visitor log. Lines were filling with names. They slid down in neat black letters with a timestamp I didn't recognize, a format nobody used. The column said time of death instead of sign in. I stood with my mag light in my hand and watched the first name go by. Vera Royas, 0303. I laughed because what else do you do when a glitch calls itself a ghost? I went to the keyboard and pressed esc. The list kept writing. Seema Patel, 0303. A couple of the last names were familiar from weekends. Families in the Armenian section that brought pastries and talked to the stones as if the dead were just slow to answer. The printer spat out a label. I peeled it and stared. A visitor pass with a blank oval where a face would be if we used the webcam. It wasn't blank like no image had been captured. It was blank like a smudge of refrigerated glass. When I lifted my phone to film it, the oval blurred the room behind it, as if the sticker was a lens. Luis was supposed to be in the shed finishing the 2-cycle mix, but he had a habit of sneaking cat naps on the padding behind the mower racks. He's the senior hand, early 50s, coffee thermos never more than an arm away, hat with the Hillview patch that he taps twice before he starts the steel trimmer. When I radioed him, he answered on the second chirp with his gravel voice. Say again. The software is logging people as dead. Names I know. It's printing passes. I think it's a virus. Turn it off and on, he said. He yawned, and I pictured his scarred knuckles curled under his chin. "And if someone knocks, the gate don't open. Sheriff Ree said keep it locked after midnight. You remember?" "I remember." I went around to the server closet, which is a fancy name for a plywood door beside a framed map. The Yale lock on it sticks unless you pull up while you turn. Inside, it's just a tower, a switch, and a laminated sign that says no drinks. I crouched and blew dust out of the vents like that was it. When I came back, the keyboard felt cold. Not night in an empty room cold. Frost cold. I pressed the shift key with my index finger and made an involuntary noise because it was like pressing my tongue to a battery. The instant I touched it, the electrical buzz of the office lights dipped away like someone turned a dial. My radio sizzled and went dead in my ear. The rain against the window slowed. I heard nothing, which is not what silence sounds like. There was no fan, no coyotes, no cars on Foothill. Just me, and in the hallway camera on the monitor, another me walked past the door. I jerked my hand back. The room snapped alive and my radio hissed. On screen, the second me was gone. The program had added 3 more names. Ackerman V0303, Eleanor K0303. The time column, instead of reading AM or PM, had seconds counting as if the deaths were scheduled like deliveries. I've always been stubborn in stupid ways. I put the mag light on the desk and slid my finger back onto the shift key. The world muted. In that strange, shallow silence, the other Ellie on the north camera came into view, shoulders hunched against the drizzle, maglight beam sweeping through cypress and angel statues, heading toward the columbarium. The date stamp in the corner said tonight. Her breath made little clouds. The tiny bell on its velvet cord in the hall twitched 1, 2, 3 times in that slow tugging way. The cord lifting half an inch, the clapper strangled by somebody's invisible fingers. I stood there with my finger on a key and watched myself walk. The caretaker's ledger lay open under my elbow. I closed it so I had room for my palm. There's a printed plot map tacked to the corkboard with a brass pushpin that drops out whenever someone slams the door. I've retrieved it from the floor enough to know every coffee stain on its edge. I made quick notes because writing makes fear manageable. Mislogged names, cold key, bell cord tugs, and something else that had been minor until now. For 3 nights, grave 1243 had been opening like a breath. I saw it on my patrol. A fine seam of damp earth domed that had been flat when the sun went down. We thought it was settling. We tamped it. It domed again tonight, neat as a bread loaf. The nameplate was blank. Not missing, not scraped. Blank. Luis came in with the wet smell of nylon and fuel, his boots tracking little diamonds of gravel. He has a way of scratching under his hat without taking it off, thumb along the edge like a nervous tick. Why's the printer going? Because it's possessed by a quality control demon, I said. I slid the blank face sticker to him. Visitor pass for who? For nobody. He blew on it and ran a finger down the reverse, which should have been adhesive but was smooth as glass. Cold. It's like the window in the chapel when we keep the heater off. Watch this. I pressed the shift key. The room dimmed. The printer paused between lines like it had been holding its breath. On the monitor, my double continued west along the north path. Then she stopped. She turned like she knew she was being watched and raised her light. The beam fell dead on the mausoleum steps. The camera did that thing it does in bad compression when the picture stutters. In the stutter, I saw shadows not moving with the rain. In the silence under the steps, something hummed. It was a low needle sound, faint like a transformer 2 blocks away. Then everything reanimated. The radio barked. Hillview 2, copy. I lifted my finger and breathed. Go for Hillview 2. County, the dispatcher said. Not Ree. Mora tonight, young and careful, voice like he's reading. 2 hikers called about coyotes cutting across your outer road. We have a unit 10 minutes out. We have coyotes every night, I said. Luis made a face and mouthed, don't invite them in. Roger. Just passing it on. Stay safe, Ellie. We did our checks anyway. The gate was locked, the padlock wet and tight. The chain I looped twice for my shift lay exactly where I left it. But the east side cam showed the maintenance gate relocked in a different hole. I have habits. I used the 3rd link on the chain because it sits right against the fence post. Now it was in the 4th, stretched strange, a different angle. The chapel light was on, which meant motion had tripped it. Water ran off the eaves in ribbons that looked like beads on camera. We had a repeating name on the log. Patel again. Roja again. I stuck my head in the hall and listened. The bell rope lifted 1, 2, 3 slow tugs. It didn't ring. I went out because office logic made me feel like a coward. The drizzle needled my cheeks. Ocean lights guttered and came up as I passed, blanching the world to ghost water. The columbarium wall is a big grid of square niches with brass faceplates and tiny keyholes. I carried a ring of keys we never used because families don't come at night, but there are traditions and we keep the keys. A Yale for the server closet, master padlocks for the sheds, a slender brass key for the niches, and a heavy brass for the main. We call that one the shift key, which is a joke about shifts of people, not computers. Luis jingled it when I first trained me. It's the one that makes you feel like the keeper of something older than you. Under the mausoleum steps, the humming was fainter than I had expected. It wasn't electrical. It had no harmonics, just a single thread of tone like a tea glass someone runs a finger around. I felt it in my molars. I felt it in the hollow under my rib cage. I lifted my mag light and played it across the stone. The steps were slick. A damp snail track glistened where there shouldn't be snails in this weather. My breath fogged, then failed to fog, which I did not like. The North Path camera pole clicked softly as if a relay was cycling. I don't recall choosing to put my free hand in my pocket, but it was there. Fingers around the brass shift key. It was warm. The keyboard shift had been cold like winter glass. This one had the heat of coins in a palm. Background faces have a way of sticking to you when your job is to watch. I thought of Mr. Ackerman with his wet wool coat that steamed in the office when he came to ask about a block number he never remembered. I thought of Seema Patel, who coughed like paper tearing when she climbed the hill to her sister. I thought of Rojas, smelling lightly of nickel tobacco and apologizing for bringing marigolds even though the sign says no live planting. And Angela Bautista, her hair smelling like lavender lotion, who pressed her cheek to the cold brass plate when she thought I wasn't looking. Their names had flickered on the screen and ticked into a column that might have meant tonight, might have meant never. They felt like sheets I had misshelved. When I came back to the office, I dried my hair on the towel we use for hand washing the mugs and found Luis standing too close to the hallway, body angled so his left ear was toward the bell. "Do you hear it?" he asked, barely above a whisper. "The humming," I said. "No, listen, it's like somebody whispering names in the cooling fan." I killed the heater. We stood there with our hands tucked under our arms and listened to the tower. The fan ran, then ran down slightly like a breath. The speaker I didn't know the system had gave a little pop, and then a railway station murmur came out like 100 people talking from the next room over. It wasn't words. It was the shape words make in a throat. Luis took 2 careful steps backward until he put his hand on my shoulder. It was funny in a wrong way because he'd called me kid for months as if the things we dealt with were mowers and invoices. The printer chewed, spat another label. I grabbed it before it fell, and this one wasn't blank. It was a reverse name, white letters on clear, like how you put office hours on a door so people can read them from outside. Eleanor K. I didn't like that it was my first name. I didn't like that it put the letter after it like a file tab in a cabinet. The timestamp was 03:03 tonight. The sticker sucked heat out of my fingers. I dropped it and it fell face up. The letters were still backward on the desk. "Coincidence," Luis said, in the tone you use for a kid waking from a nightmare. He tapped his hat twice, automatic. "We can call county." "Get a unit to sit across the gate." "Why?" I said and heard the answer. Because the shift key was telling us when to expect the shift to end. The security cams had 4 quadrants. I toggled the north path and got myself walking again, except now the other me was sitting at the desk, chin in hand, pencil ticking the blotter, looking up at the bell as it lifted and fell. She looked tired. Her hair was darker than mine, wet enough to darken near the ends. She looked exactly like me, which made the difference feel like an angle you don't find until your shoulder hurts. I toggled the chapel view. The candles in the stand were dark as they should have been, but their copper cups trembled. Or my hand trembled. In the corner of the chapel frame, past the kneeler, the reflection in the glass of the holy water font did not line up with anything in the room. It showed a street. I know I said every scene stays in the cemetery. The glass violated that as if it were a window, and I knew that if I put my face over that bowl, the coolness would not be water. It would be night. The grave with the blank plate had raised itself again by the time the clock crawled to 2:30. We logged it with the little 2-line report form, because day shift needs documentation for backfill and family calls. Mislogged grave. Relocked gate, damp soil. Lantern wick failure if we had lanterns. We don't. But the maintenance shed has a hurricane lamp for earthquakes, and Luis swears it wouldn't stay lit last Tuesday when he tried to check the drains in the chapel. He had it in his hands while he told me, and as if the story had summoned the thing present, he struck a match. The wick flared, guttered, pulled itself down into the sleeve, and died with a breath like someone leaned over and exhaled. I'm saying this to put off telling you the part where I actually tried to unplug the computer like a cartoon. The dot matrix was chewing through a feed of stickers now, a meandering ribbon across the desk with reversed names like a list of people reading a mirror. Some were tomorrow's date, some were next week. Eleanor K. remained tonight. I crouched and reached behind the tower and found not the handful of cables I expected, but a handful of slick rubber that moved when I touched it. The cords coiled around my fingers and then slid, not fast, not in a way that hurt. They just reclaimed themselves as if they were live and had no intention of being removed. I got a strange idea that if I forced one, whatever was on the screen would spill somewhere to make room. Luis said my name like my mother says it when I have dropped a dish. I stood, my hand stinging, and saw the monitor show not the room but the hill between the veterans section and the small angel child stones. It was a live feed, raining, and another camera angle I didn't have. The grave with the blank plate was open just enough to show slab. A white sticker shone on the slab's slick surface as if it had been placed under there when the concrete was dry. The date under my backward name was tomorrow. The bell rope lifted. One slow tug, as if someone on the other end was considering whether to alert us or just acknowledge an appointment. Then a second. After the third, the building flickered. The sodium lamps outside hiccuped black and then returned, and the clock on the wall shifted to 3:02 with a single minute hanging like a window open in a storm. The thing about pressure is it makes every tool on your belt honest. The mag light weighed a brick and the beam was solid and pleasing as it cut across the office. The Yale server lock took the key like it owed me a favor, and the switch saw my hand and pretended to resist. The air tasted like pennies. Luis said he would sit by the gate with his radio and count 40 seconds, then call county. He has a habit of pulling his hat brim down when he is scared. He did it. Come back, he said, as if I were going farther than the hall. You hear? I pressed the cold shift key because I wanted to make the world stop so I could line my thoughts like index cards. Everything slipped to quiet. In that quiet, my double in the monitor stood from the desk, and on the other camera, the one that looks down the gate road, a patrol car sat idling with its lights off. Inside the cab, there was movement like a person shifting. The seat steamed as if someone had just vacated. I couldn't hear the engine, but the exhaust ran a white thread into the drizzle. The flip of the radio mic in the car was visible. Nobody held it. It rose a quarter-inch and fell, a motion no camera should have bothered to capture, like a heartbeat counted by a machine. I took the brass shift key on its ring and pocketed the reversed sticker with my name before I had time to call myself stupid. When I stepped out, the bell cord hung still. Coyotes yipped thin as wires. The world didn't smell like rain alone. It had a vinegar metal smell like coins soaked in dishwater. The chapel lamp saw me and switched itself on. My boots found the slick spots they always found and still slipped a little, which is how panic shows up in feet. My breath fogged. Then it didn't. The humming under the mausoleum steps rose in a thin ribbon. I don't have a hero move. I had stubbornness and a ring of keys and a radio that said nothing until it said too much. I walked to the blank plate grave and lifted the maglite beam along the seam. The soil was lipped. It had a neatness to it that a shovel doesn't give. It was the neatness of pressure from beneath and rain hardness from above. The nameplate had the holes where screws go. There were no screws. There were no letters. Water beaded on the brass and hung in rows. I put the sticker flat against it because something in me said if it stuck there, I would be part of this the way you stick a prayer into a crack. It didn't stick. It clung to my wet fingers as if it loved me and had no interest in anyone else. I had to peel it off. I left it in the pocket. I circled. The North Path camera caught a slur of motion that wasn't me. It was like my body shape, but thinner. The maglite made it visible in the way you see dust when you shine a beam through dark. It moved opposite my step and then matched it and then took it from me, which is to say my foot lifted and the world made the choice for me where it would land. I landed on the first mausoleum step without intending to. The humming climbed a half tone. The radio in my chest crackled with County asking if anyone had eyes on coyotes. The bell rope was not visible from here, but it found its way into my mind as if the building were pulling the cord for me. 1, 2, 3 tugs timed with my heartbeat. I put the brass shift key into a pocket, again because I didn't want it to influence anything. I touched the granite base of the mausoleum with my palm. The cold shocked my fingers and fogged my eyelashes. When I lifted my hand, perfect prints remained, not in frost, not in condensation, but as if the stone wanted to remember me. I gripped the rail, which is bronze with filigree leaves, and looked down into the square of the ventilator grate under the steps. What returns smell and sound when the world is ready to open is not the dead. It is the idea of schedules. In the grate, a white thing fluttered like a trapped moth. It was a label. The letters were reversed. I got down on my stomach on wet stone because that is the kind of choice I make when a problem hides inside a place, and I cannot stand not knowing its mechanics. I slid my fingers into the grate. The thing below slipped from me, as if the air had skinned it in cold. A sliver of light flickered to my right. In the chapel, through the window, a computer screen bloomed to white. That made no sense because the office was in the opposite direction. The white light pulsed once per second like a respirator. I swallowed and counted. When I reached 60, County's unit should have been at the gate. In my radio, there was a single burst of soft feedback like someone pressed the push to talk without speaking. I pushed back.
Unit at Hillview's gate, do you copy? Silence.
Then another tiny breath of static. I ran. You don't think about cameras when your feet go. The motion lights picked me up in bright drops. The night opened and closed around me like someone was lowering and raising a shade. At the office door, the air felt 10 degrees colder. Luis wasn't visible from the desk. His thermos sat on its side, a damp coffee crescent on the blotter. The chair was still warm. My name in reverse was stuck to the inside of the window without adhesive, like it wanted the city to read me as they drove by. Like it wanted to be seen by the outside because the inside already knew. The computer monitor showed the gate road, but the patrol car's front seat was empty. On the driver's seat was the depression of a body, warmed enough to fog the windshield and left oblique. The dash cam in the frame's left corner showed a loop. It showed me approaching the car. It showed nobody in the car. It showed the same. It started over. I don't have to say the clock said 0303. It held there like a note you aren't sure ends. Stupidity and courage are cousins. I yanked the tower out from the wall by main force and hit the power toggles. The cables snapped taut and then slack as if the tower exhaled, but they did not leave the sockets. They slid like live things into the narrow gap between desk and wall. In the gap, the white of the wall migrated like a ripple. If I sound insane, understand that I was making physical contact with our tools and they were not behaving as tools. The keyboard's shift key depressed on its own. I saw it, the plastic sank. The monitor blinked. The entire cemetery view streamed into one camera frame. North path, chapel glass, mausoleum steps, gate. The hummed note rose, then stopped as if a finger had left the rim of the unseen glass. In the freeze, on every screen, my double was caught mid-breath and then the frame ticked forward one, and in that one tick she was gone. I pressed the Motorola to my mouth so hard it hurt. "Luis, answer me." His reply was a whisper from very near at the hallway threshold I had not checked where the bell hung. "I am here." He had his hat in his hand, which I had never seen at work. He looked at the desk as if it were a cliff. He lifted 2 fingers, tapped the hat patch. "You don't pull things that want to go. You know this. What wants to go?" "Everything," he said with a bleak certainty. "But they line up and they wait. They don't like us opening the door when it's their turn to ring." The sticker inside the window wet itself with condensation from nowhere and froze in a thin skin. I put my hand to the glass below it and felt nothing. No cold, no warm. If I breathed on it, the letters cleared and then fogged again in the mirror of the pane. My name backwards in the city glow. I looked at the log on screen and saw that the names had completed. A full column of 0303 for every human being I had named in my head, and for at least 4 more I had watched for months, but never learned because it is easier not to, and for the first time I thought that maybe the schedule wasn't about heartbeats or accidents. Maybe it was about attention. The system had printed passes for people I noticed. It had given them little tickets to the other side of the glass as if awareness is the match you strike and the wind pulls. I took the brass shift key from my pocket and laid it next to the keyboard. The brass had warmed from my palm. The computer shift was still rimmed in frost. I remember details because this is how I believe someone later. A drop of water ran from the window and pooled on the desk. It touched the sticker and refracted under it as if the plastic were thicker than printing stock. I reached to peel it and felt a resistance like a suction cup. The bell rope lifted. 1, 2, 3 slow tugs, spaced so far apart it was worse than banging. The door to the hallway breathed open half an inch and the chain on its inner side ticked. I had to choose. I could go to the hill and sit by grave 1243 and wait until morning and pretend the world is weather, not signal. Or I could push back against a schedule I wasn't invited to keep. When you are 21 and you think you have time, you choose against drunk fate. I grabbed the tower by the perforated side panel, pushed the desk away with my hip, and shoved my other hand into the tangle until I found the heavy plug. It slid under my skin like it wanted to learn the shape of my bones. I pulled. The lights dimmed and then flared. The fan wailed. The monitor showed me in grainy rollover from a camera angle that did not exist. I was holding a label to the inside of a window. The date below my backward name changed from tomorrow to today. 0303. On the speakers, the murmur sharpened into a sound like paper slowly torn. When the screen went white and stayed, the tower went silent. The fan stopped. The bell did not ring. It hovered in the ready. I had a half second of relief. Relief like a field when rain finally lets go. The sticker peeled itself from the glass and fell face down. I heard a patrol car nose against the gate chain outside. A little clank, cautious. Sheriff Ree or Mora trying not to spook me. The printer, which I had not stopped, rolled one more label. It had no name, no time. It was a blank oval like a mouth shut tight to keep in a breath. That blankness felt more impolite than the reversed letters had. I stood to go to the door and the office chair swung back under its own weight like someone had just stood. It was warm. The rest you could watch on the tape if you had my access. The camera in the hall shows me walk to the gate, talk to a dark that has the same height as a man, hand up in a gesture of weight. The car headlights wash me front on. My mouth moves. My face flattens under sodium. The gate is still chained. No one else is in frame. Something thin and white slides down the inside of the gate, turning as it goes, and you see that it is plastic. The camera in the office shows the sticker on the desk curling as if heated, then relaxing, then curling again. The gap at the bottom of the server closet door widens half an inch, and a thin thread of white light comes through. It is not bright, not like a real bulb. It is the brightness of a cathode in the earliest moment of ignition. All of it, everything pauses when the wall clock's second hand taps past the 3. The keyboard's shift key goes down without a finger on it. I won't argue with you about what a person is. I am telling you that when Sheriff Ree walked into the office at 3:07, coffee in her hand and something like "I told you to call me" on her mouth, she found a room that smelled slightly of wet pennies and printer ink. The chair was pushed back as if I had stood. My hoodie hung on the peg and dripped a widening circle onto the rubber mat. The little bell on the velvet cord was still lifted a hair. A visitor sticker was stuck to the door glass at face level. Letters reversed so the world outside could read them right, which it did, which is how my mother knew in the morning without needing the call. Luis says a shift is a thing that moves a pattern off one axis and onto another. He said it to me one dawn before any of this when we watched fog roll like fabric across the veteran stones, and I pretended to understand. He sits some nights on the bench by the gate and taps his hat patch twice and sips coffee and watches the hallway where the bell rope hangs and lifts. He tells the day crew the office printer needs replacing and then laughs at himself and goes quiet. The caretaker ledger on the desk has one entry for that night that somebody wrote with my hand. Damp soil, relocked gate, mislogged grave. It has a little grease smudge at the corner that you would say is from my hamburger if you didn't know I eat granola. He keeps the brass shift key on a nail instead of his ring now. He calls it respect. He doesn't close the server closet quite all the way. He says you shouldn't suffocate a thing that runs hotter than it should. If you climb the hill at dawn when the sodium lamps click off in their chain and the city haze glows like a hand cupped over a candle, you will see a columbarium faceplate with no name and 2 tiny screw holes that collect water and let it go. You will see a grave whose soil rises and then relaxes with rain. Good soil, well tamped, no worse than the others. You might smell vinegar on a breeze and think of pennies. You might hear a faint humming under the steps and tell yourself it's the night warming. If you stand at the office window and cup your hands, you will see a faint rectangle of adhesive residue in the shape of a pass, and you will hear, from the hallway you are not in, the bell cord lift once, twice, and after a little breath of time, a third slow tug that never quite lets the clapper ring. The sound that woke me wasn't the wind or the harbor bell or even the rattle of the nameplates on the older stones when the squalls blow in. It was a small metallic chink, like two coins catching against each other, carried up the slope through the drizzle and into the watchhouse. My maglite rolled on the desk and knocked against the ledger, and the iron gate at the road gave its low, steady hum the way it does when a storm leans on it. I sat up and held my breath and heard it again, bright and precise. A penny hitting iron. Another followed, and another, each a little farther along the rail. I'm Mrs. Caro, late 60s now, last of the old caretakers out here on the Salem outskirts who still talk to the stones. Watchhouse is what we still call the square brick cottage just inside the gate, though most nights it's me and a rusted kettle and the radio on scan. I'd come because of the pennies. Folks said they were for promises kept and debts called in. The city sent a boy last month to replace me, kept him a week after he tried to pry one loose and the gate slammed his wrist without a wind in it. He swore off night shifts and I swore off retiring. When the weather turns and the sodium lamps paint everything the color of weak tea, I can feel the old place settle around me, and I know what it wants to tell, even when it says it with a single coin. On the desk lay the ledger I'd found that afternoon, a long book of brown paper and careful ink, wrapped in oilcloth inside the chapel cabinet. Favors, someone had written on the first page. It was a list that went back to coal smoke and horse prints, safe berth, spared sailors, sick children who got one more summer. The names ran down the paper with little notes beside them, and next to certain ones, those ending well, someone had drawn a tiny triangle, as though the dot of a letter had been sliced. Pennies with triangular nicks had begun appearing on the gate 3 storms ago. People had noticed. Teenagers notice pennies, and the wrong kind come for them at night. I checked the Motorola because old habits don't die even when you get old, and then I put my coat on and stepped into the drizzle. The gate road was slick and black and shining. The ironwork rose ahead, taller than a man. Black paint pocked with rust like the back of a stingray. When the wind comes off the harbor, the bars sing. Not loudly, not like a choir, but with a low hum you feel more than hear. Tonight it was in my ribs. Out by the road, the sodium lamps haloed the damp with a sour pink light. Gulls wheeled for no reason I could see, and then stilled all at once the way a choir breathes together before it sings. 3 slow bell tugs came from the chapel, soft and deliberate. I stopped. The bell rope is braided hemp dark as old tea, hanging beside the side door. We don't ring it after 5. Not since a winter in '94 when a man heard it after hours and went walking fast and slipped and broke his hip on the ice. We hung a sign beside the rope to make it clear. Hours and such. 3 pulls now, measured and patient. The drizzle ticked on the slate roof and birds stopped mid-squawk as though a hand closed over their beaks. I didn't move until the 3rd tug ended, and when it did, the hum of the gate swelled for a heartbeat as if an answer. "Len," I murmured without thinking, because the old groundsman taught me to treat the bell like a person and the gate like a cat. Len used to polish the nameplates with a bit of vinegar and water, and talk to Malone and Prentice and the Harkness baby, who only got 2 months in the world. Len is dead and buried by the willow, and when I clean his stone I can still catch a faint vinegar metal smell that makes me turn around, hand to my hip, expecting to be scolded for missing a corner. It wasn't that smell now. It was wet iron and sea. At the gate, the pennies were perched along the spear points like gulls, each with that small triangular nick. They'd been added since I'd walked the perimeter an hour before. The first bright clink had been real. They arrive when the weather hums. They mean someone remembers a promise. They mean someone expects payment. I touched the nearest one and it was cold and real, not the thin-lipped brass you buy online. My hand shook and the coin trembled and I heard a sneaker scuff the gravel behind me. "You leave them," I said without turning. "I already told you that." The boy had a hood up and a hat under it. I could tell by the way he stood that he was trying to look bigger than he was. He had the earmarks of every teenager who tried to jump this fence. Jittery feet, hands deep in pockets to hide the itch to grab. He'd come the past 2 nights, same time, always the same angle, using the old cedar stump to get a foot on the rail. Each time I'd opened the watchhouse door and he'd dropped back like a cat from a counter, but he hadn't left. Tonight his breath fogged the pink air in a long pale ribbon, but the air was only a mild cold, a drizzle, not enough to frost a mouth. "Just watching," he said. His voice had a music to it that told me he was the sort who talks his way into and out of things. "That one's falling." "They're not for you," I said. They're not for anyone alive. How would you know? He moved closer. Even under the sodium light, his hair looked the color of wet wheat. He had a dimple that appeared when he swallowed. Someone's handsome nephew. It's money on a fence. Pennies on the gate are promises, I said. Put by the ones who asked or the ones who received. You take one, you take on the promise. That's the rules. Whose rules? The dead's. I looked at him then, and his eyes were gray and too still. No lash flick. No blink in the drizzle. A drop ticked my cheek and I wiped it. And when I looked again, his dimple was gone, as if the thought that made it had passed. What's your name? He glanced toward the chapel. Don't be mad, he said, which is something my son used to say when he was little, right before the truth. He lifted his hand out of his pocket and there was a penny on his palm. The triangle nick was so clean it looked stamped. I already took one. Put it back. He nodded and I felt relieved, as if something very heavy had rolled 1 inch away from my chest. He stepped toward the gate and reached up and set the penny on a point, and there was the clear metallic chink I'd heard. That thin, bright note that carries even in the wet. I felt the bars hum under my glove for a breath, a long note, a throat clearing. The boy's palm hovered over the rails, and the drizzle gathered into a bead on his thumbnail. It trembled and fell and left no wet print where it had been. I walked the line. It's a thing I do when I'm nervous. I check the lock and the hinges with my hand. I test the Yale. I look at the gravel on the inside of the fence to make sure no one has dug at the bottom bar. And I count the 4 spear points where we saw doubles the winter. The high schoolers decided the cemetery would be their stage. No sign of tampering. The pennies sat like sentries, each nicked, each faced outward. The harbor smell thickened, then thinned like someone testing a mouth organ. The boy had turned to look at the chapel as if he knew something was in there that wanted looking back. Don't go near the rope, I said. His mouth quirked. Why have a bell if you don't ring it? So we can hear when it's rung by the wrong hands. 3 slow tugs sounded, patient and low. I felt the hair on my wrist lift. The boy flinched and then laughed too loudly. He looked at me again and I saw that the rims of his eyes were too clear, almost like glass. The drizzle threaded the sodium light into long needles. The hum of the iron deepened. The night went bumpy after that, like a path where the frost has heaved the stones. An entry in the new lot log didn't match where Mr. Baines is buried. The soil by the willow was damp where it shouldn't have been and dry where it should be damp. A name appeared twice on my route list as if the printer had hiccuped. Harkness, Harkness, and I could hear Len muttering about double booking from under the willow. When I took the steel blower out of the shed to clear yesterday's leaves from the chapel step, the cord pulled once and then slipped back like a fish from a hand. The blower righted itself after a second try. A lot of things did that night. It was the kind of weather that lets a place show you its seams. Albie came at 9 to look at a limb overhanging the old Perkins plot. He's 50 and talks like every sentence is a secret you're already in on. He calls me Mrs., though he knows my name and chews a cinnamon toothpick in a slow, thoughtful way that keeps time with his footsteps. Storm's a Hummer, he said, hearing it as soon as he came through the gate. Mrs., you got a note for me? Perkins' limb, I said, and handed him the work order. Cinnamon softened the cold air around him. He tipped his ball cap as if there were a sun and not a sullen lamp. We walked to the limb together and he whistled low and set his hand on the Perkins marker the way one lays a calming hand on a skittish horse. She's heavy, he said to the stone, and then to me, steel will do it. You want it tonight? It can wait, I said, because tonight had its own business. You hear the bell? 3 pulls. He didn't stop walking as if the bell had been a dog barking 2 streets over and not inside our fence. I'll close the shed tight, Mrs. Kids ghosting around? Maybe, I said, and then, because Albie is useful for reality checks, you see that boy by the gate? What boy? The one with the hood. He scanned the slope and the path and peered under the willow curtain and into the gates of the small mausoleum, where the Lafferty family keeps their bronze vases in a neat row. He shook his head and switched the toothpick to the other side of his mouth. The scent of cinnamon stayed beside me 5 paces after he left. By 10, I'd read more of the ledger, the paper going soft under my old fingers, and my eyes had made their peace with the neat, tilting hand. The favors were simple and human. Free the coughing child. Bring my husband from the storm. Spare a cow. See my boy back through winter. I sat with the kettle and thought of my son in Florida who doesn't call often, and my husband who loved a harbor, and the sound the masts made when the wind walks through a marina. I thought of promises I have made with my old mouth and kept or not kept. I thought of how a debt sits on a gate, waiting for someone to come and pay it. The boy was back on the watch house step when I went to refill the kettle. He sat with his hands braced on his knees the way runners rest, and the rain made threads in his hair and never soaked it. "Don't be mad," he said again. "Tell me your name," I said, and sat too, because the old boards are still under my care, and I will not have people stand over me in a place where I've spent half my life. He looked at the chapel, at the side door with the braided rope just inside. "Evan," he said finally. Then he added, soft as a thought he wasn't sure he wanted to share, "Harkness." I felt that inch of heaviness move again on my chest. In the ledger, in a column that had to do with winter, there was a Harkness twice, and one of them had that careful triangle mark. I had not read far enough to know which had been spared and which had not. "Evan," I said, "how old are you?" He shrugged the way boys do when any age is too old to say. 15, he said, and pushed a wet curl off his forehead with the back of his wrist. "You hear the bell when I don't, you see me when he doesn't. Albie?" "The one with the toothpick," he said, almost smiling. Then the warmth left his face as if someone had wiped it clean. He looked at the gate. 2 pennies lay now on the gravel inside the fence as if the iron had tossed them back. His breath fogged, then stopped fogging while he was still breathing. "Let's go look at the ledger," I said, and he followed me inside, which I did not expect. A boy will follow an old woman into a watch house if he's a boy. A boy will hesitate if he's more. Evan did both. Inside, the kettle began to murmur, comfort in a room where the harbor master's chart of 1898 still hangs crooked above the coat hooks. The maglite lay across the book like a paperweight. Evan stood where the lamp made a square of light on the floor and the rest of him was shadow. "Read your name," I said, and turned the ledger on the desk. The ink was good and the hand had been careful. Harkness E. promised a spared winter. Paid. Then a space where someone's pen had blotted, and then the word winter again, darker, as though the day had been brighter when it was written. Below it, Harkness, Evan, and beside it, in careful letters that took thought, "Drowned that spring." The triangle mark that meant paid sat beside the first Harkness. Not his. He leaned in and I saw the muscles of his jaw move. A drop of water fell from his hair onto the brown paper and sank without making it darker. I asked, he said. They said yes. I went out on the pond after because I thought yes meant always. "They gave you a winter," I said. "They didn't promise you the spring." "I wanted to pay," he said. "So I come and put pennies. I don't take them. I put them until she sings right." "Until who sings right?" He looked at the gate then, though we were inside and the watch house window was fogged by our breaths. He put his hand into his pocket and took out another penny. It had the nick that meant yes and the copper gleam that meant someone's hand had warmed it somewhere that isn't here. Evan laid it on the desk and it made a small sound that felt very large to me. 3 slow bell tugs came, quiet, patient, one after the other. Evan's mouth softened into a shape I could bear to see. He lifted the mag light with a care you don't usually see in children and handed it to me like a baton. We went out into the drizzle together. Albie had locked the shed tight. The Fiskar's trimmers hung in their slots and the steel sat where it should, as if it were a dog waiting to see if we would bring it along. The hum of the gate thickened with the rain. I've never been able to explain that hum to anyone who hasn't stood under it. It's not a power line buzz or a tuning fork ring. It's what I imagine a voice would sound like if it had a chest of iron and a throat of salt. Tonight it vibrated against my teeth. Evan walked toward the gate with a penny in each hand. He did not look left or right. He stood where the road met the fence and lifted his hands and set the coins. The first struck and clinked and settled on the spear point. The second clinked and skittered and fell inside the fence to the gravel at his sneakers without a bounce. "That one isn't mine," he said. "You have to put yours." "I don't owe any," I said, before the lie had time to taste bad in my mouth. Then I thought of the winter my husband needed a lung, and how I sat in this very house with my hand on the radio, whispering to the iron that I would work another 10 years if it let him see the spring. He didn't. I worked the 10 years anyway because there are rules even for liars. Maybe I do. "Please," he said, and the please was an old please, a child's, the kind you hear from the back bedroom when a fever is high. The ledger felt heavy under my arm. I set it on the gatepost and opened to the page with Harkness and the careful triangle. There was a blank below it where the pen had left room for an ending. The wind off the harbor found a way through the iron and made the hum resolve into a tone. I took a penny from the watchhouse drawer earlier because sometimes the kids come with pockets out. It had been in my coat since then. I took it out and looked at the face. No triangle, Nick. Bare and bright and new enough to feel like a lie. Evan lifted his hand and put his penny back on a spear point. It settled without a sound, and my skin knew things were moving none of my senses could chart. The drizzle thickened. The sodium lamps blinked and steadied. A gull called and cut off mid-note as if it had been pressed mute. "Put yours," Evan said. "You owe her. She's humming wrong because of you." I didn't argue. An old woman on a wet road under a humming gate is allowed to conserve her breath for yes or no. I put the penny on the spear point where it had fallen before. It made no sound when it settled. The hum exhaled. The iron felt less like a throat and more like a chest, rising and falling. Far to the left, down by the caretaker shed, someone laughed. Officer Delgado walks through sometimes at night with his flashlight, and his hands tucked in his vest for warmth. And his laugh is a bark you hear before you see him. Tonight the laugh was Delgado's, but softer, like a memory of it passing behind a hedge. I held the mag light steady and cast a beam to the shed. No one. The Fiskers hung like good soldiers, and the steel sat patient. The bell tugged again. 1, 2, 3. The chapel door stood ajar with the sign beside the rope glistening with wet. "Do not ring after 5. The words looked new and foolish. Evan's shoulders widened and then thinned in the wet as if the world were reconsidering the shape of him. "You've been keeping him out," I said. "I don't want him stealing them," Evan said. He had no anger in him. His voice was a weather report. "I got to pay." "He doesn't. He thinks they're cash." "He sees you?" I asked, because it mattered to me whether I had lost my mind entirely or only partly. "Enough to make him mad," he said, and his breath fogged again for one brief cloud and then disappeared. The next hour was a chorus of small wrong notes that wanted tuning. The gate latched itself after I had thrown it open for Albie to drive through. I had to use the brass key twice when it shouldn't have needed it once. The map in the watch house showed the Perkins lot as 10 feet longer than it is, and then when I measured in the rain, it wasn't. Nora Lafferty's bronze vases were turned all in one direction like school children who'd been told to face the board, and the damp on the path dried in a rectangle as if a rug had been set down and lifted. From under the mausoleum steps came a faint humming not of iron but of a throat, as if the concrete itself were clearing itself to speak. I checked the steps with the mag light and found only a spider in a corner and a moth that butted the beam and then settled for the stone. By midnight, the storm arrived as a proper storm, the drizzle turning to ropes of water and the sodium lamps bleaching the world into pink photographs. The gate's hum filled up my jaw. The bell sent 3 more slow tugs into the rain. The gulls were silent. I felt the wind in the seams of the watch house and set a saucer under the corner where, every hard nor'easter, the roof will leak despite every man's promise to fix it. I made tea and set a mug for Evan, though it would only steam the air where he sat. And he sat anyway and looked at the ledger with the expression of someone reading a childhood book in an unfamiliar edition. It was just past 1 when the pennies began to move. I don't expect you to believe it, but I know what coins sound like because in a hard year I rolled them at my kitchen table and took them to the bank in paper sleeves and hoped. Tonight they clicked and chimed with the irregular grace of birds settling. I stepped out and the rain flattened my hair, and through the wet I saw the pennies shift on their points as if a small hand were nudging each one into place. The humming rose and split into a major and a minor that made the skin between my shoulder blades feel too small for my back. Evan stood by the rope and stared up at the bell. "You can't ring it," I said. "Not after 5. The gate wants to sing," he said. "She can't if I don't. I've seen rich men make worse choices with less reason." I nodded and set the mag light on the altar rail so the beam went up into the bell tower. Evan took the rope in his hands as if it were something alive, and he pulled 1. The bell spoke the way a big pure thing speaks when it has a reason. 2. The sound went under the skin of the iron and made the gate's hum answer like a low harmony. 3. The night paused on that note the way a wave pauses. "At the top before it falls, officer." Delgado's radio rasped somewhere near the perimeter. "Dispatch got a light in the chapel," he said, and then, "Never mind, it's Caro." Because he knows that even if I'm in bed at home, I am also here. His footsteps approached, He stopped and he didn't come in. "You good, Mrs. C?" he called. His voice made the words small out in the rain. "I'm good," I called back, and the gate took that word and hummed it so that it felt true in my mouth and my chest and my old bones. Delgado laughed the bark laugh that sounds like a gull that has opinions. He went back to his perimeter and the rain washed the sound away. The pennies began to clink one by one like drops from a tin eave. Evan pulled the rope again and the bell made 3 slow tugs on the air. The sound threaded itself through the iron and the old stones, through the willow and the Perkins limb and the watch house door, and the moth's thin, tired beating on the window screen. I felt something inside the hum shift, like a boat changing its mooring line. I've had babies and I've buried men, and I know the feeling when a thing that's been held too long moves to where it should be. The radio on my hip crackled. "Gates open," Albie said, breathless, as if he'd come running. "Mrs. Gates wide." "It isn't," I said, and then looked down the slope and saw that it was, the black bars standing patient with nothing between them. The lock lay on the gravel, the shackle closed, as if it had been unlocked and set down by a careful hand rather than forced. The pennies did not fall. They held their posts. "Don't be mad," Evan said for the 3rd time that night, and now I understood who he was speaking for. "Put your last one," I said. He reached into his pocket and his hand came out empty. He looked at me then, and for the first time the hood fell back far enough for me to see the shape of his ear, the way it cupped and turned in like a shell that has learned to hold the ocean's song. "I don't have it," he said. "I gave them all." I walked to him. My knees told me not to hurry and my heart told me to. I put my hand into my own pocket and found the penny with no nick, the one that had felt like a lie. I held it out to him. "It's not marked," he said, but his fingers closed around it all the same. "Make it so," I said. He bit the edge carefully. His teeth left a triangular notch cleaner than mine would have managed. A small, perfect wound in the copper. He set the penny on the spear point nearest the watch house, where the first one had arrived in the first storm. It caught and held. The hum deepened and then rounded. The way you hear a choir find the 3rd note they've been missing. The bell gave 3 more slow tugs without his hand on the rope. The rain softened. The sodium lamps flickered once and then steadied. The gulls began their ordinary petty complaints about nothing. I heard the steel settle itself imperceptibly on the shed floor, as if it had been tensed for a run and changed its mind. The damp where it shouldn't be was now damp where it should. The willow drip matched what the sky was doing. The Perkins limb lay its weight the way a tired arm lies on a pillow. Evan stood without breath fog and without the pale ribbon that had made me sure he had 1 foot somewhere colder than this. He looked at the gate and then at me, and the dimple returned, small as a penny's glare. "Can I go now?" he asked, not of me but of the iron. The gate gave a hum that felt like a nod. He turned as if to go down the lane and then paused and reached out and pressed 2 fingers to the ledger. They left no mark. He walked toward the road. He did not open the gate. He passed between the bars as if the iron were water, and as he stepped out onto the lane, the pennies on the spear point settled with a collective small chime, like a long-held breath leaving a room. I waited for the cold that sometimes comes after a thing like that. It didn't. I poured the tea and drank both cups, one for me and one for him. Delgado waved his beam at the watch house window and I waved my hand back like a neighbor. The steel slept. The Fiskars gleamed and then dulled with the drying air. Dawn in this place is an old woman's kindness. It does not rush or brighten up the world with careless fingers. It rubs warmth into the stones and lets the salt ease back into the marsh and lets the iron cool its voice. At first light, I walked the perimeter and everything was where it belonged. The mislogged grave on the map had righted itself. Nora Lafferty's vases faced every which way again because the living are untidy. The damp was damp. The willow apologized with small drips. A buoy bell far out gave a single sound that meant calm water. At the gate, the pennies still perched, each with that small triangle notch. The Yale lock hung where it should, solid and ordinary. I touched the cold brass key in my pocket and my hand felt steadier than it had in weeks. On the watchhouse porch, there was a single penny on the little mailbox someone put up in 1973, and no one uses. It was balanced on the lip, not glued, not trapped by rust, but perched as if a careful hand had put it there and taught it to wait. I took it into my palm and felt its weight. The triangle nick was neat and true. The ledger lay open on the desk to the Harkness page. Someone had written in a hand finer than mine, paid, and drawn the triangle in the margin with a tiny flourish as if pleased to make things neat. I closed the book. I set the penny on the sill and went to the chapel. The rope lay still. The bell had done its work. The sign that says not after 5 looked less foolish in daylight. Albie arrived at 8 with the steel on his shoulder and cinnamon in his teeth and said, "Mrs., that limb's asking for it." And I said, "Give it to her," and he did. And the roar of the chainsaw made the gulls go up and Albie grin, and the iron hum quiet as if content to let other tools speak. When I locked the gate at 9, the hum was a memory. Delgado signed the log and put a small smiley face by his name because he likes to make me scold him like a schoolteacher. I scolded him. The wind came off the harbor smelling the way mornings do when storms have gone, like something new. Like wet rope and tar and a baked bread you didn't bake. On my porch that afternoon, in my little house down Collins Street where you can hear the harbor in your pillow if you leave the window on the latch, there was another penny. It sat on the railing, bright as a bead, with the triangle nicked tidy and small as a cat's ear. I took it inside and set it in the shallow dish where I keep the keys that fit locks no one uses. The house felt very quiet but not empty. I slept in my chair for an hour without the whispering that sometimes comes when the night has too many stories. You can believe what you like. That a wind hissed through the iron and the copper moved in a way that made a song. That a teenager learned a lesson about theft. That an old woman's mind softened and made a kind ending for itself in a place with good stones and a dependable gate. I walked back at dusk to check the lock because once a caretaker always, and the gate stood with its spears polite against the sky. The pennies held their neat line. I touched the Yale and felt the good click of a thing that means yes and no at the same time. The way a person's mouth can. The sea wind came just then and the iron woke a little. A breathing hum, just a pulse of it. And from the chapel, soft as a hand on a shoulder, came 3 slow tugs of the bell. It stopped. The gulls argued about a clam they could not open. The pennies didn't move, but they sounded once, a faint bright clink that seemed to travel along the gate and into the road and out toward the harbor, where a single buoy answered in its sleep. The rattling started like a handful of dry beans in a tin can. Pebbles ticking down a slope where there wasn't supposed to be one. Then the flagpole halyard knocked twice against the watchhouse and the ground gave a slow sigh. The kind you hear through your boot soles rather than with your ears. A nameplate on a sandstone border stone tapped as if a small animal had nudged it with a nose. That was the same minute my radio clicked without transmitting, and something under the Chapman family plot took a breath long enough to make the bouquet ribbons lift. I'm Nate, 31 heavy equipment operator for St. Isidore's Cemetery, out on the borderland between county ranchland and the tribal allotments. I run the backhoe for graves, the steel trimmer around markers, and the compact loader when we need to level or shift. I'm good at not hitting what shouldn't be hit. I've only been a dad for 5 months, and that has me measuring everything twice. I was on the night shift that week because we'd had 2 slumps after monsoon storms, although the last rain had been over a month ago. We can't have a family come out and see a marker yawning. I take that kind of thing personally. St. Isidore's isn't green like the cemeteries in movies. It's a Sonoran grid in crushed, decomposed granite, Ocotillo fence on the west side, a low adobe wall on the east where the parish end stops and the allotment land begins. The desert isn't empty. Javelinas slip in at dusk and move like shadows stitched together. Challa sit out like landmines. We built shade over the columbarium with corrugated tin that chatters when the wind gets under it. The lamps are sodium and make everything look the color of forgotten fruit. When the air is still, you can hear Interstate 19 like a shell at your ear. On the nights it's not still, it's the desert talking, small things hissing through thorn. It began with a mislogged grave. I remember because I had the brass key for the back gate in my pocket and was walking a perimeter to keep my mind off how badly I wanted to nap in the watch house. The county's plot map said Mendoza, row 15, stone 8. We had a fresh tag hammered in at the corner of the grid, brand new paint. But Mendoza was sitting on row 14, stone 8, and stone 8 and row 15 was a patch of ground so neatly brushed it might have been swept with a broom. Not a weed, not a footprint. I crouched and held my mag light low like the old caretaker taught me. Raking light tells the truth. The soil there had a subtle sag, a shallow smile wider than the plot itself. The second thing happened the same night. I locked the north gate with the Yale, Checked the shackle twice, and on the way back to the watch house I found it relocked the other direction, chain laced in the opposite pattern. That would have meant somebody unthreaded it entirely and redid the knot left-handed. I'm careful about that chain because one twist of it makes the padlock hang low enough to grind on the post, and we're forever filing burrs off. I stood and watched my breath make a ghost in the lamplight. It was a cool night for October. The desert cools fast and climbs back warm again between midnight and dawn. You can feel that flip if you stay outside long enough. The third thing was smell. Vinegar and metal. A tang like when you open an old thermos that held coffee through a summer. It rolled across the gate road and into the watch house as I stood leaning on the doorframe, the brass key cold against my thigh. I stepped back out, maglite beam quivering over gravel, and the smell folded in on itself as if it had only been stored air. We set microphones into the ground near the north line after that cheap wildlife mics my coworker Alma bought online with her own money because she likes data and she likes proving old men wrong. She's small, fast, laughs with her hand pressed flat to her chest and keeps an orange bandana tied around her wrist because her grandfather did. She edits her notes with a green pen so she can see the corrections. Alma put out 3 mics the way you'd spread cards, then ran the cables to a little recorder in the watch house. The ground should be quiet, she said, tapping a nail on the table. That's the point of compacted fill. Quiet means stable. Tell the javelinas, I said, and she smiled with half her mouth because she doesn't like giving anybody a full smile until they've earned it. On the radio, our groundskeeper Pete said he was making a pass by the southeast wall and we should tell him if the mics picked up his boots. Pete shuffles out of habit like someone who learned to walk again. He's in his 60s and carries a rosary that clicks quietly in his pocket. He says the same thing when he walks past the columbarium at night. We are only stewards. The mics picked up sand hissing, then a deep inhale that didn't belong to wind. We listened with our heads close together, the recorder's blue light putting a little lake on the tabletop. You could hear individual grains moving like they were being sorted. Then the long draw of air from somewhere underneath. It made my teeth feel loose. The watchhouse window showed the sodium light on the Chapman plot bow slightly, and stay bowed for a count of 5, like a mattress giving under someone rolling over. Could be trapped air under fill, Alma said. But she said it the way you say something to keep yourself from saying nothing. She wound her bandana tighter and stood up to go outside. The old caretaker stopped by the next afternoon before the sun had a chance to really cook the rocks. People call him Ray, but his name engraved on our donor bench is Reynaldo Portillo. He retired years ago, but he still brings mesquite cookies for Pete and trips the breakers on the chapel when the swamp cooler makes the lights pulse. Ray walks with a squat and always wears a straw hat that looks too new because he takes a wire brush to it. He visited us in the watch house with a little tin of cookies and a sigh that suggested we were making work by doing work late at night. Some dead travel, he said, settling into the molded chair like it was a saddle. He gnawed a cookie like it was jerky, and the living should not follow. Don't mistake a path for permission. I told him about the mislogged grave. He clicked his tongue. The plot map is correct, he said without looking at it. The ground moves. It does what it wants. Same as it did when we were filling the wash with chunks of a burned shed. We built on its back. I can't put a family on row 14 when the map says 15, I said. They'll bring their own map with a printout and act like we stole their name. Ray picked up the brass key from the edge of the table and weighed it in his palm like a coin. That key's old, he said. You know it was to the bell tower once. We don't have a bell, I said. We did when my father was a boy, he said, turning the key so the light caught the notches. 3 tugs for last rites. Sometimes a wind tugged 3 times too, and if nobody was dying, my mother would put a basin under the bell rope so the water would remember to keep to its own paths. I didn't know what to do with that, so I put the key back in my pocket and the tang of vinegar and metal lifted again, very faint, like it lived in the stitching of the leather fob. We borrowed a ground sonar rig from the irrigation district. It's the kind of thing you push in front of you like a lawnmower, all orange plastic and stickers telling you not to tilt it. It reads density change and sends back a picture that looks like a heartbeat. The first night we used it, Alma kept saying clean reflection under her breath because she liked the way it sounded. The rig was pointing at a rectangle under the Chapman and Mendoza rows. The shape was sharper than anything I'd seen under our fill. Clean corners as if someone had cut a box into the earth with a perfectly straight shovel. It's not a void from collapse, Alma said, adjusting the gain. That would look fuzzy. This is a room. She marked it on her tablet like a slow elevator under the plots, moving 9 feet in the hours we watched. When we went back to look with the mag light, the ground didn't show anything new, but I felt the hum in my ankles. Not noise, a pressure with rhythm. I bent and touched the sand. It was warm as a dashboard after sunset. That shouldn't have been. The night had been cold enough that the watch house window had fogged on the inside when we breathed on it. By then, families had been out during the day. I'd taken directions from Mrs. Haskin, who always smelled like wintergreen and pointed with the side of her hand. Mr. Benally came in with a hat in his hand and left with dust on his knees, and he thanked the Blessed Mother aloud in Navajo when he found his aunt. The Odom kids ran race lines between rows, and the youngest one had a cough like a tiny dog. I keep track of names. I keep track of sounds. It's how I remember who belongs here, because everyone does eventually. I'm careful, I log. I measure. The fourth anomaly came as a relighted candle in the chapel alcove, even though I'd snuffed them. I don't like open flame near old varnish. The wick had drowned in wax when I pinched it, and yet it was burning again a half hour later when I stepped in to get more zip ties. Heat hovers near the ceiling in the chapel. That night it lay on my shoulders like a folded blanket when I stepped in, and when I shook the blanket off me in the parking short, the air tasted of dull pennies. I blew the candle out again. The flame sighed the way the ground had sighed earlier, and I backed into the night with the hair standing on my arms. The fifth thing was my own fault. I lowered a steel probe near the Chapman corner because Alma said we needed data from the edge of the moving rectangle. I use a fiberglass tape because the steel ones get kinks and then they whip, but the probe was metal and it hissed as it slid down like it had been dunked in water, only there was no water. When I pulled it up, I had to drop it fast because it was hot enough to brand. I put the brass key between my teeth while I used both hands to keep from touching the probe again, and the taste was sour and bright like vinegar and metal together. That was when Ray said his thing about the living not following. He stood with his hat against his thigh and watched the ground the way you watch a sleeping baby, like it's beautiful because it's still.
Y'all hear it, right? He said.
This place is breathing. That night I fell in. I was alone at the edge of the southeast, rounding the Ocotillo where the fence looks more like a crown than a barrier. The mics had been pulling in quiet for an hour. My radio was nothing but occasional squelch. The sodium lamp above the columbarium clicked twice and then stayed steady. I was making a note about repainting the Mendoza corner when the ground under my right foot gave like a trampoline and then shrugged. I didn't feel the drop so much as I felt the idea of dropping, like my body had decided to finish something gravity had started hours ago. For a second I was belly down on smooth sand, my mag light clutched under me, my cheek full of grit. The next second I slid into a room without edges, a shallow cave that was brighter than it should have been because the sand itself gave back light. Everything held still after that, the way it does when you've spilled something on a counter and your brain is figuring whether to watch it spread or grab a towel. My maglite beam ran into ribs. That's what I thought in the first flash of panic, ribs. But they were not bones. They were roots. Mesquite maybe, but compacted and fixed in a shape like the hull of a boat. They arched over me, held together by the weight of sand and by something like varnish. There was a smell of vinegar and metal so strong my tongue went numb for a second. There was also a soft humming so low I thought at first it was my blood in my ears, only it was too slow for a man. On the far side of the cave, where the ribs came down to the floor, there sat a plaque half buried in sand. It was black metal, soot-colored, not new, not rusted. Someone had pressed it into the sand while the sand was damp. Then the sand had dried around it and held it there. The words were simple: no room above. I crawled toward it and my mag light threw shadows that made the ribs look like they were flexing, only they weren't. They were fixed as old fence posts in cement. I had the stupid thought that I should knock on the plaque the way plumbers tap pipes to listen. My radio crackled and said nothing. The air was warm, not hot like the probe had been, but warm like a car heater left on low under your legs. I touched the plaque anyway, and the humming leaned toward a note that almost found a tune. If you'd asked me then, I would have sworn it was 3 voices trying the same pitch until they could match it. I swept the maglite. If you work long enough around graves, you know what kind of small things people leave behind that are too humble to get noticed by cleanup crews. A leather baby shoe under a bench, a plastic ring in the pea gravel, a pin with a school mascot on it wedged behind a vase. I saw those here, only more of them, arranged with care as if a child had tried sorting by color. A blue rosary like Pete's lay coiled beside a metal tag stamped B6. There was a hair ribbon with sun bleached into only one side of the bow. There was a brass screamin' eagle coin that Mr. Benally had shown me once, balancing it on the lines in his palm as if the grooves had been cut for it. Things I recognized from different plots, cleaned of dust, gathered here in a neat crescent against the root ribs. They weren't stolen. That word didn't fit. The right word was brought. The cave shifted, not to collapse but to breathe. The ribs took another long inhale and my back registered the tilt of sand under my knees. I kept the brass key in my hand because it had become the most real thing I owned. I don't know why that felt smart. Maybe it was the weight of it, the way the teeth bit into my palm when I squeezed. I put the key against the plaque and the humming found that almost note again. 3 voices. Like an old song sung by people who hadn't rehearsed together for a while. There wasn't panic until the first handful of sand let go under my left hand and ran like sugar out of paper. I pictured the rectangle moving under us, that clean room on the sonar. I pictured it sliding toward the fence line and me sliding with it. And I felt the pinch of time that turns caution into action. I dug the mag light into a root rib like a piton, got my shoulder under and kicked, trying to swim up a slope so shallow it was like trying to climb a dream. Sand takes your effort and smooths it out. It doesn't give much back. I got my elbow hooked over a root and for a second the smell of vinegar metal got sharp enough to cut tears loose from my eyes that I didn't have time to blink away. "Nate?" Alma on the radio, voice clear in a way that made no sense. "You fell in the southeast? I'm on the road now. Do not go deeper. Stay to the roots." "Here," I said, and sand got into that word and turned it into a cough. Light from above edged something square, not the plaque. The opening. Alma's headlamp threw a white circle onto the ribs and her shadow made a quick moon on the sand. She flattened her hand to keep balance and slid down a foot and stopped. She is sensible in bad moments. She ties her bandana tighter. She breathes once and then she moves on purpose. "Give me your key," she said, which is not what I expected, and I must have looked confused because she said it again. "The brass one. It's heavy. It'll hold the rope in the notch so the knot doesn't slip." "What rope?" I said, dumb as a bucket. And then I saw it as she flicked the beam past me. The old bell rope, the one Ray keeps coiled under the watch house workbench because it's good hemp. She had it around her waist and she just looked at me like I'd caught up to a moving truck and now needed to throw myself in. I did what she said. I dug the key's teeth into a root rib notch and wrapped the rope once and then twice. And I knew exactly the right tension because it felt like tying a kid into a car seat. You pull until the slack is gone, and then you give it one more honest tug because your chest won't let you stop. Alma leaned back, found her footing, and then the root rib cracked with a sound like a joint popping. The cave made that exhale again, long and slow, a thing alive and big and tired of pretending. She hauled while I pushed, and I don't know if it was Pete at the top bracing his knees against a headstone, or if it was the ribs deciding I wasn't cargo, but the next breath of the cave pushed me up as hard as I crawled, and then I was waist out and then I was on the gravel, on my back, and the stars were holes punched in black metal. My mouth tasted like a penny kept under the tongue for luck. Alma lay beside me, panting and laughing, small, hand flat on her chest, her bandana stained darker where sweat had soaked it. The cave let out another breath. It wasn't afraid. It wasn't angry. It was busy. The sand ran toward the center like a tablecloth being tugged. We sat up, and the opening where I'd fallen looked shallower than it had, like the desert had smoothed its covers. The plaque was buried to the lip. The words "no room above" flashed once in my maglite beam and then were gone. We did not follow. We brought the rope back to the watch house and coiled it without talking. Pete came in and set his rosary down and pressed his palm over my hair like I was a kid who'd been found at the edge of a crowd. We sat and listened to the recorder. It gave us the hiss of sand and the slow drawn inhale, and then, for less than 10 seconds, something else. A lullaby I didn't know. 3 voices trying to meet in the middle of a tune. Soft, unafraid, like daybreak before people wake up. Then static. Dawn comes to St. Isidore's from the east, and it comes with color you don't expect if you haven't lived here long. The rocks hold purple for a minute. The Ocotillo tips go red as embers. Families came in their usual way because grief has a schedule of its own. I took a call from dispatch about a truck driving too slow down the county road, and then I stepped outside with a rake to smooth the high spots, because we always make the place look tended before anyone sees it. By 8, there was a single sunken line running the length of the Chapman and Mendoza rows, A long subsidence like a couch cushion, where 3 people had sat and then stood up together. The markers along it had tilted toward the center as if listening. 20 graves along that path had lost their edges. The room under us had moved and had taken the geometry of the place with it. The families that came that morning were quiet when they stood at the sag. Nobody yelled. People who yell make sense to me. The quiet doesn't. The quiet says somebody already knows the answer you're afraid to ask. I told Pete I was done. You don't say I quit when you work where the ground keeps the names. You say I'm done and you mean it as a fact rather than a door slammed. Pete nodded without surprise. He reached into his pocket and pressed the rosary into my hand, and I gave it back. Because it isn't mine and because I'm not Catholic. I took the brass key off my belt and left it on the nail inside the watch house door. It looked older there than it had in my pocket. I went home and held my son while he fussed, and I felt lightheaded with gratitude at how heavy he was. I said I'd go back that night for one thing I wanted to leave. Not a test. Not a dare. A toy. A cloth bear with one ear bent that my wife had bought at a yard sale and washed until it smelled like sunlight. I had the thought that my boy would want something left for him, somewhere safe in case he ever had to sleep without us. Knowing where exactly he'd put his head, I parked on the county side because I didn't want to ring the front gate. The desert has its own lights at night if you don't drown them with yours. The Ocotillo fence threw long, thin bars across the ground. I stepped along the watch house wall and the key wasn't on the nail anymore. That was fine, keys move. That's what they do. I had a flashlight in the toy bear and a paper bag and my phone in my back pocket. Because I thought I might trip and need to call someone. The sodium lamps hummed. The chapel looked like a box you'd keep bread in, warm and honest. The air was cool enough to sting the inside of my nose when I breathed through it. I set the toy at the edge of the long sag. The place where the Chapman row kissed the Mendoza row like a seam you could press together. The bear sat upright because the sand cradled it. I put a hand down for balance and the ground was warm again. The kind of warmth you get from a sleeping dog before the dog knows you're there. My phone decided to record a voice note because my back pocket pressed the button, and so it caught it, the ground's slow inhale, then the exhale, and then the lullaby again, cleaner this time. Like the 3 voices had found each other since before. The toy tipped. The sand under it moved like a neat hand pulling a sheet edge. The bear slid down an inch and stopped. Then another inch. Then it sank quiet the way a coin disappears into a fountain's soft bottom. I had my fingers touching the sand and I swear it lifted against my skin in thanks. My phone hissed and the lullaby clipped into static. There was the faintest taste of vinegar and metal at the back of my throat. I didn't try to reach. This wasn't a taking, it was a making room. I sat for a minute at the seam and then I stood and stepped back so the ground could smooth itself. By the time I got to the watch house door to look for the brass key again in case I'd been wrong about leaving it, the sag behind me sounded like a held breath let go. I looked back and the line was honest again. Smooth as lake water, Ray would have said, showing a new hat brushed clean. I didn't go back after that. I left a message for Alma that I was grateful for the rope and for her being exact when I wasn't. She texted 3 words. We are stewards. Pete added a 4th for a while. Ray brought cookies to my place a week later and didn't ring the bell. Just left them on the stoop and drove away in a truck that sounded like a sewing machine. He had fixed the bell rope coil in the watch house, he said later, and guessed that someone else had taken the brass key off the nail because it wasn't there next morning when he went to check the breakers. I told him it was fine. Keys move. That's what they do. Sometimes at night when the baby won't settle, I walk the tile of our kitchen and put an ear to the cabinet to hear the rattles and hisses of pipes in the wall, so small and busy. There's a penny stuck under the fridge and I leave it, because I like the way it makes the corner feel weighted. The house breathes in its way, and sometimes at the edge of sleep, the air tastes faintly of vinegar and metal, like a reminder that there are rooms beneath us built by something that is not interested in being a secret, so much as being itself. When I turn out the lamp, the darkness makes a soft sound that could be 3 voices checking a note before they sing. And somewhere, I guess, a key touches a notch and holds. The first sound was the slow rattle of a bronze nameplate on the lakeside gate, tapping like a coin against glass every time the wind changed. The second was the soft chuff of the shore water slapping the riprap. The third and worst was something I couldn't place at first, a thin brassy tang that rose with the drizzle, like vinegar wiped across an old coin, While I caught the nameplate to stop its chatter, the bell rope that hangs near the chapel door twitched once without a hand on it. The geese honked from the gray band of lake and then went dead quiet. I'm Daria, forewoman at North Shore Memorial, a long, narrow cemetery tucked between the commuter tracks and a glacial lake that breathes fog like a living thing. I've been here 11 years, long enough that the tourist ghost tours used to annoy me and now just amuse me. This past fall, a developer put cash on the table to buy what they called unused ground on the lakeside, where the fence bends to make a shallow peninsula of turf and reeds. They had a rendering of a boardwalk and 22 condos that would have sold in a week. The city liked it. Our board politely entertained it. My job was supposed to be simple: flag the boundaries, mark setbacks from stones, and show that most of it was indeed lawn. The first morning I set stakes. The fog crawled in bands, low then high, and the drizzle made a sound like frying bacon on my rain hood. I took the little club hammer from my shoulder bag and started at the northeast corner by the service road, counting my paces and the tape measure's pull, listening to the brass bell in the chapel thunk once as if it had settled on its rope. Miguel was cutting suckers from the yews with his Fiskars, citrus hand cleaner drifting off his gloves. Ty from the grounds crew chewed peppermint and spit into the grass. We were unbothered by the lake or the sky or the steady hiss of geese wings as they rose and then set back down. I planted a red tape stake, then another, then sighted my line along the wet grass toward the lake lot. When I came back from my lunch break, 3 of the stakes leaned like someone had pressed a forearm to them, and the 4th lay flat with the tape cut. The slice was clean. We blamed teenagers. I hammered fresh ones, took photos with my phone, and logged the time in the ledger. That night at home, the cemetery app tagged my photos as taken at home. I checked the metadata. It said home right there. The next morning, when I walked the line, my compass spun lazy circles whenever I pointed it toward the rectangle of lake lawn we were about to sell. I didn't bring this right to the board, because people hear what they want to hear, and what most of them wanted was funding to fix the columbarium roof and re-slope the old section, where frost heave had turned stones into ribs. So I did the thing you do when the site itself starts acting like it has a will. I leaned harder into my process. I had the modern plat in my zip case laminated and clipped, and the old ledger in a plastic sleeve because Mrs. Calhoun, our volunteer whose wool coat always smelled faintly of lavender, insisted I carry the original page for Section E. Hands-on history, she said, tapping the column where someone had once scrawled in pencil, then inked over it, Pauperfield, and then crossed it out. With one thick red line, the drizzle worked into my sleeves as I walked the perimeter that afternoon. Mr. Weiss stood by his wife's stone, with his hearing aid whistling, and I raised my hand to him. The lake breathed the damp back at me, and the air had that vinegar metal smell again, strong enough that I wiped my tongue against my teeth without meaning to. On the trail down to the water, a narrow path of flattened grass appeared where there hadn't been one in the morning. It led between reeds straight as a line drawn with a ruler, and then stopped at the shore foam. I radioed Leo, our maintenance lead, who says don't borrow trouble so often. It has the sound of a prayer coming off his tongue. He reached the lake lot, rubbed his jaw, and crouched to look at the cut stake tape. Clean slice, he said. Box cutter or a good knife. Don't borrow trouble. Could be kids. Kids with ethics, I said, nudging the new stake I'd set with my boot. They cut this one but put it back upright. Or your guy over at the city, Leo said, meaning the developer's rep. A woman named Annika in a camel coat who clicked her pen when she thought nobody could hear. He shifted his cap. You want me to set the steel blower on the trail and see if its footprints are just matted grass? We did. He feathered the throttle and blew the flattened path from the lake up toward the chapel. Nothing appeared but damp blades lifting. No prints, no scuffle. When he killed the steel, the quiet was big enough to hear the bell rope twitch again. 3 slow tugs against the clapper, without a person at the pull. That was the first week of the stake moves, and we played it like a game we were sure to win. The second week, my phone mislabeled the location again as home. It was almost funny until I found a photo tucked under a low stone that had never once had flowers, not in 11 years of my rounds. The photo was mine, from my childhood, me and my grandfather on a pier somewhere with gulls behind us. My mother took that picture. I know, because she always cut off our feet. The edges of the photo were soft with wear, as if someone had kept it in a wallet. I took it to the watch house to dry it next to the register where we keep the spare brass keys to the older mausoleums and the little box of nameplate screws. The watch house smelled like damp wool and old coffee. I stared at the photo until Leo came in, saw my face, and said his line. I didn't quote him back. I checked the stone. The name was Ruth B. Crane, 1901 to 1979. I looked for flowers or notes in the grass. Nothing. I went back to the watch house, took the ledger out, found the page with the red cross out. The pauper field notation sat there like a joke no one remembered the punchline to. When I turned the page, a tiny flakes of paper lifted and drifted like ash. I tapped the dust into my hand and heard the lake against the riprap, steady as breath. For the first time in years, I thought of my grandfather's folding knife, the one he used to whittle when he watched the news. He was buried 3 towns west in a Catholic cemetery with a 4-foot oak on his plot that had no business growing that fast. I pressed my finger against the red cross out until the ink shine dulled under my skin. At 40% of any project, you either settle into your stride or you start to wonder if you missed the turn. By then, we'd restake twice. The developer sent a surveyor with a robotic tripod who set it up by the fence line, while Ty and Miguel dug a French drain around the caretaker's shed. The surveyor's compass head spun at the lake lot and then steadied when he moved 2 steps back toward the watch house. Anomaly, he said, acting like that word meant everything and nothing, which it does. Annika clicked her pen, then clicked it again, then tucked it behind her ear. Daria, she said, if you want to shift the rectangle 5 feet inland to avoid whatever that is, we can still get the square footage we need. We don't shift rectangles around graves, I said. We scap it against stones, not the other way. Unused ground, she reminded me, eyes on the plat, not the grass. I appreciate your stewardship. We're not monsters. We're not monsters, Leo echoed later in the watch house, pouring coffee into a styrofoam cup and handing it to me because he knows my hands don't stop shaking until the coffee gets warm. 3 slow bell tugs came from the chapel while we looked at the ledger. Kit, he said, or wind. Don't borrow trouble, I borrowed it anyway. That evening I walked the lake lot at dusk alone, because you cannot feel the shape of a place until you go out there when it is empty and see what fills it in your head. The fog sat in bands, the lower rolling over my boots, the higher a wall with edges like a torn bedsheet. The geese honked once, a single throat answering, and then were gone from the sound of it. The vinegar metal smell rose again, sharp enough it made my eyes water. I switched on my mag light and blew steam into my cupped hands while I waited for my breathing to slow. The first time I heard the humming, I thought it was the tracks to the west, a freight dragging steel somewhere you couldn't see. The second time I heard it, it was directly under my boots. Not humming, I realized, but the kind of vibration you get when you put your ear on a lamppost in winter and hear a current you can't see. I stomped my foot on the turf. It thickened under me, dull as if I were standing on wood under dirt. I took the surveyor's tape from my belt and stretched it straight from the watch house corner to the lake edge, sighting the old section marker stones like a constellation. The tape snapped as if someone had flicked it. I told myself the cold made it brittle. I told myself a lot of things. Annika, to her credit, didn't press me the next day. She only stood by the chapel door under the sodium lamp glow and said, "My grandparents are in Park Ridge. I don't want to be the villain in a story you tell over beers." "You won't be the villain," I said. "You'll be the paragraph that looks reasonable right before everything breaks." Ty laughed at that when I told him later, and then saw my face and stopped. He chewed his peppermint to cover the silence. Miguel said he'd seen something down by the water when he went to clear driftwood that morning. Like Rose, he said. Like when we lined the flags for Veterans Day, but no flags. "People?" I asked. "Like people," he said, and shrugged the way men shrug when they do not want to admit the thing scared them. He smelled like citrus again. I made him show me. We walked the matted path that appeared and disappeared in the same place each day now, and we stood where it ended. The water lapped. The fog wall breathed in and out. A blue jay called and then shut up mid-note like someone put a hand over its beak. At dusk, the fog parted. Rows of people stood at the waterline, backs to us facing the lake. No motion, no tilt of heads. Their clothes had the texture of time. Some in suits that belonged to the century before last. Some in work jackets with dirt on the elbows. One with a scarf that had threads pulling. None of them turned. The vinegar metal tang was strong enough to make me gag. Miguel whispered a prayer in Spanish. I said Leo's line under my breath and didn't believe it. We stood like that as if we were in a museum where the painting might shift if you waited long enough. Rows like that don't appear and then vanish. They believe themselves into a place. The fog closed. The shore slap resumed. I didn't ask Miguel what he had seen, because when two people see the same thing, you are bound together by whatever chain of narrative keeps your head from coming off its hinges. The next day, when I came into the watch house, my grandfather's pocket knife sat on the register by the spare Yale lock keys we use for the back gate. I hadn't seen that knife since his burial. The bone scales were worn smooth by his thumb. I pressed the nail nick and opened it. The vinegar metal smell rose from the old steel like the smell you get when you open a mason jar of pennies. Inside the handle, where the liners left a pocket barely wide enough for a folded stamp, was a paper folded twice. I opened it with the care I reserved for the old ledger, and there it was, a map drawn in pencil, then inked, then traced in red, with the cemetery lines as they were when the lake's corner was cut by a county road that had since been removed. The rectangle we meant to sell was labeled Pauper, not Pauper Field, just Pauper, like the mapmaker thought the word covered enough ground by itself. I took the map to the old ledger page, laid them side by side. The cross-out glowed in my eye. I rubbed my finger along the pencil hatchings until they left gray on my skin. Mrs. Calhoun came in with her lavender scarf bunched against the drizzle and looked over my shoulder. "Hands on history," she said, softer this time. We stood listening to the bell rope twitch twice, then a third time, the sound traveling through the wood like a low heartbeat. She put her hand on mine. "You'll tell the board," she said. And I nodded because there was no longer any part of me willing to let this drift into the pile of things we call anomalies and then forget. But you do not get to the part where you tell people the truth about a place without something, testing whether you can hold it while it shakes you. The test came the night the survey team returned with headlamps and set up their tripod in the drizzle. Annika had brought a thermos and cups and wore a hat with a little brim that had already lost its shape. The geese moved again like ghosts in a vanishing point. The crew placed stakes where I had placed them, then 5 feet in, then 5 feet out until the red ribbon looked like tiny flags at a kid's birthday. Leo was at my shoulder. Ty and Miguel stood by the caretaker shed, their breaths like smoke. Mrs. Calhoun refused to go home. Old Mr. Weiss had the bad sense to stand in the rain with his hearing aid off, so he wouldn't hear us when we told him to go. The fog rose, then dropped, then held, all its edges squared off by the orange of the sodium lamps. I felt the humming under my boots again. Not like electricity, not like tracks, but like a low argument under the surface of the ground. My maglite beamed through a white path across the grass. The vinegar metal smell came up hard enough to make the backs of my teeth ache. The surveyor muttered about an anomaly. The bell rope twitched once, twice, 3 times. The people appeared again, rose at the waterline, backs to us, not moving. I walked toward them, not because I am brave, but because the fog made a hallway for me to walk down, and sometimes your body moves before your mind. The red tape flags flicked in the damp like little tongues. The humming under the earth thickened. I could feel it in my knees. I got close enough to see the threads on the scarf that tugged from the shoulder of one figure, to see the seam in a boot, to see a braid tucked under a collar, but not their faces because they did not turn. The lake breathed and the fog held. Leo hissed my name. I did not stop. The forced choice was not a lightning bolt. It was the quiet recognition that I could either pretend the map in my pocket was an artifact, with sentimental value and nothing else, or I could accept that we were standing on a field that had taken in the anonymous and expected to be left alone. The surveyor called, "Daria," and I turned to see him with his tripod lifted, unsure where to set it. The tape measure snapped again in my hand like an animal trying to get away. I lifted the knife. My grandfather's knife is not magic. It was a tool used to cut twine and to open the backs of envelopes and to whittle boats nobody ever finished. I used it to cut the red tape from the stakes nearest the water. I pulled them up and walked them backward until the rectangle receded from the shore. I tore the tape into shorter pieces. I retied the tape around the stakes in a new line that matched the old map. I did this while the humming, under the ground pressed up against my arches, and while the vinegar metal smell turned my mouth brackish, and while the bell rope tugged 3 times, again like someone tugging the sleeve of your coat. Annika started to say something about footage and approvals and city council, and I held up the ledger page without looking at her. I think she saw my face because she stopped. The surveyor resighted his tripod. The tripod made a chirp and then steadied. He nodded without knowing why. The geese honked once. Mr. Weiss put a hand on his cap. Miguel breathed in like he was bracing for a wave. Ty took his peppermint out and stuck it in his pocket because there is a moment where you don't want any small thing on your tongue. But the air of the place you might owe your life to the rows at the waterline didn't turn. They didn't need to. They filled the fog with the idea of a line we were now following instead of crossing. The humming under the earth went soft as if whatever it was had decided it could sleep. The vinegar metal smell lifted enough that I could taste my own coffee again. I laid the last stake as the fog rolled in to stitch the lake and the land back together. When the rows were gone, there were only our tracks, back and forth over the same ground and the little red tape tongues licking in the wind. It did not end there because nothing of consequence ends at dusk. It ends when paperwork is signed. The board had their meeting in the chapel, while the drizzle made a halo on the skylight. I laid the old ledger page on the table and the pocket map beside it, I said calmly. That the lake lot was a pauper field never marked on our modern plats because someone had decided in 1924 to spare the Catholic families the shame of adjacency. I told them the stakes had moved without explanation, and the compasses spun and the phones thought we were home. Mrs. Calhoun spoke about hands-on history. Leo said don't borrow trouble and then said we had already borrowed it and owed it back with interest. Annika looked at me for a long time and then looked at the faces of our board members. She did not click her pen. Her hand rested still on the table, fingers flat. I have grandparents, she said again, and the way she said it this time did not sound like a negotiating strategy. She didn't have authority to withdraw the bid, but she had the good sense to ask for a pause while their company decided how they wanted their name to sit in a story. During the pause, their demo generator refused to start on that lot. Even though it started fine 100 yards inland, their drone lost connection. Their sight camera fogged from the inside. Regular equipment failures, nothing supernatural. But the kind that stack up until the ledger on your project says not worth it. The city cooled on the idea when I sent the map and ledger with the page where pauper had been erased and then returned. There are still people in this town who had a great-grandfather's story about a cousin put in the ground without a stone. Money is a tool. Shame is a tool. Neither is as steady as the ground when it hums under your boots. By the week after we pulled the stakes, clover grew over the rectangle overnight. I've never seen clover take like that. Miguel joked that it would bring us luck. Ty called it a carpet and refused to mow it. We didn't have to ask him not to. Even the geese stepped around it. On Sunday mornings, before we open the gate to the cars that seem to love arriving in pairs, I bring a thermos and pour a cup and set it on the clover. I stand with my mag light against my thigh and listen to the lake. The vinegar metal smell comes and goes with the wind. It never crosses onto the clover. The fog, when it comes, stops at the green and moves to either side like a river split by a rock. The developer backed off in a letter delivered to the watch house that smelled like printer toner and perfume. No money, no boardwalk. Our board floated the idea of a sign, but I told them no. We will know the rectangle by where it is quiet when everything else is noisy. We will know it because the bell rope will sometimes twitch 3 times at dawn, as if acknowledging an agreement. We will know it because the grass over it is softer underfoot. You could call it sensitive, but that would make it sound fragile. It is not fragile. It is the most solid piece of ground on the lakeside. I don't give tours. When people ask about the lake lot, I say it's closed for maintenance, and that is true in the way that matters. We maintain a space by keeping open the question of what we owe it. Old Mr. Weiss died in December and joined his wife over in Section B. And now there are nights when I stand at the gate and swear I hear his hearing aid whistle, a memory laid on air. Mrs. Calhoun still comes in with her lavender scarf and slaps my hand away when I threaten the ledger with my coffee. Leo still says don't borrow trouble, then brings me trouble in a paper bag. Photos someone left, trinkets that are not trash. He stops without being asked by the clover and tips his hat. On a wet morning that had no business feeling hopeful, I unfolded the pocket map on the watch house counter and pressed flat the creases with my palms. The knife lay open, blade dumped toward the ceiling, bone scales warm from my pocket. I traced the rectangle and its old label with one finger. Pauper, I said out loud, and the watch house settled like a person easing into a chair. I looked up at the chapel where the bell rope hangs. It twitched twice, then once. The tug so gentle I might have imagined it if the clover hadn't shone the way it does when fog leans in and then thinks better of it. I keep the knife now on a hook behind the register, next to the brass keys and the little box of screws that hold nameplates steady when the wind turns. On Sundays, I set a cup on the clover and I breathe, and the air smells like coffee and cut grass and the shore slap of the lake. Some mornings, there is a hint of that old brassy tang when the drizzle lifts. It stays just long enough to touch the back of my tongue, then thins at the edge of the green like a line drawn in pencil and ink, and then traced in red. The geese honk once and go quiet, as if listening for how the day will take us in, and the bell rope gives 3 slow tugs before stilling, the sound carrying under the door and through the clovered ground like a promise we made and kept.